This hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Secretary Blinken, welcome back to the committee, of which you have a long history with, so we appreciate you being with us again. If we're going to address the enormous scale of the global challenges we face in the 21st century, we need a well-resourced State Department with the most appropriate personnel and tools to promote American foreign policy. From the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine to increasing violence in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and a tenuous peace agreement in Ethiopia, to multiple failed states and active civil wars in the Middle East and North Africa, to the migration crisis caused by dictatorships, waves of criminal violence in Mexico and Central America, and the tragedy in Haiti, to food insecurity, severe natural disasters, and extreme heat exacerbated by the climate crisis, as well as the continuing issues related to the pandemic. So we want to hear from you, Mr. Secretary, on how you plan to ensure that the Department is resourced and staffed to project American foreign policy, including seriously countering the growing threat from China, for which I think you'll feel today, and I'm sure in your other engagements, a strong bipartisan, I think bicameral view, single biggest geostrategic challenge the United States faces. China has made major investments in diplomacy, and its diplomats are outrunning ours, not because they're better, but because there are more of them in more places in the world, with more embassies and a seemingly limitless checkbook. We cannot be on the sidelines and mired down in bureaucratic processes. We need ambitious and consistent resourcing. As you know, Senator Risch and I are working to put together a bill to put us on a stronger path to compete with China globally. This will include resources and staffing, strengthen economic tools, expanding our engagement with Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa, where there is currently a 40% vacancy rate at key American posts. Bolstering our diplomatic and economic tools to compete with China is the key to avoiding a military confrontation, while also ensuring we are ready to prevail in a conflict if it be necessary. As we've seen with Russia and Ukraine, one dictator's warped vision of the world is all it takes to unleash a brutal modern war. Our unity of purpose with our democratic allies and partners against Putin's illegal war is critical and goes far beyond Ukraine's borders. When we lead with diplomatic, military, and economic support, others follow. Our continuing support for Ukraine is not just about defeating Russia or to help Ukraine's freedom, which in and of itself are worthy goals. It's important that we send a message to others who would upend the rules-based international order. You cannot, by force, take another country's territory. The U.S. needs to use all our tools more effectively to do that, which brings me to a third priority area we'd like to see the Department address, which is security assistance. Unfortunately, for years, the Pentagon has encroached upon the State Department's vital and statutory role in security assistance, which is a critical tool of foreign policy, which we've seen most recently leveraged in Ukraine. This has increasingly untethered our assistance from human rights and American values, which I believe damage our national security interests. And it has led to policies that focus on short-term tactical military assistance, like we've seen with Azerbaijan blocking Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. So while I'll continue working to solidify the State Department's role in the provision of all security assistance and sales and seek to claw that back where it rightfully belongs and statutorily belongs, the Department has also worked to make sure we can fulfill our security assistance commitments to our partners while setting the stage to compete with and deter bad actors like China, Russia, and Iran. We must reorient American foreign policy to be rooted in supporting democracy and human rights, which serve our long-term interests. Our foreign policy needs to help activists, environmental defenders, political prisoners on the front lines of confronting autocrats. We need to be able to isolate and weaken those who undertake coups in countries like Chad, Sudan, Mali, and Guinea. We have to do more to protect women, girls, and young boys who are the targets of sexual violence in conflict zones. And finally, I want to reiterate the importance of building on the last 2 years of bipartisan work to resuscitate the State Department authorization process after a long hiatus. I think this speaks volumes about how deeply the committee values the Department's work and personnel. It's critical that we modernize our diplomatic corps so it better represents our nation's diverse backgrounds, views, and talents, and it gives them the tools they need to be successful. So we've got our work cut out for us, Mr. Secretary, and we want to thank you for being a constructive partner in this effort. We appreciate the constant dialogue between our committee, yourself, and the department, and we look forward to discussing President Biden's budget requests in detail with you. With that, let me turn to the ranking member, Senator Rich.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for always being willing to take our calls when we have important issues to discuss. I sincerely appreciate that, and although we don't always agree, as you know, it's good to talk and see if we can't find middle ground to get to what usually is a common interest and common objective, and I sincerely appreciate that. These days, there's no shortage of complex issues in foreign relations, including Russia's unprovoked war on Ukraine to China's ongoing attempts to coerce and dominate nations across the globe. The American people need a State Department that is fully capable of advancing interests and values of all Americans, and this will only increase in the future as China becomes a greater and greater challenge for us. Now, we should all remember that that is the first challenge that we have, even though we have other things going on, like the Ukraine war, which are very important to us, but we can do more than one thing at a time. China is still the challenge of the century. The department needs to be efficient and effective with taxpayer dollars and use the authorities provided by Congress. For example, my Global Health Security Act, signed into law late last year, provided state with substantial new authorities. The bill created a coordinator for global health security at the department with the power to reduce redundancy, eliminate waste, and ensure unity of effort. Remarkably, the department provided zero funding for the coordinator. I hope you're going to talk about this a little bit today. I suspect you are, since you and I have talked about it at some length previously. We also enacted my Secure Embassy Construction and Counterterrorism Act, which allows our diplomats more freedom to leave the embassy and do their job while dramatically reducing the costs of embassies. The authorities provided in SECA should enhance our presence in places like the Pacific Islands, where we are directly competing with Chinese government for influence. Secretary Blinken, I hope to hear how the department is utilizing these authorities in implementing these laws, because I remain concerned. On Russia and its brutal war, I have visited Kyiv and seen firsthand the destruction and resilience of the Ukrainian people, as well as the work the State Department personnel are doing to advance our security. There is clearly more that needs to be done, though. The administration should stop its dithering and follow the lead of allies like Poland and send the F-16s. I don't want to see this administration push for a ceasefire in December, because not enough is being provided now. It's important that the help be provided now. Also, while I have consistently advocated for giving Ukraine more of the systems it needs to win, I've also been clear that we must conduct rigorous oversight to ensure that our aid is effective, as well as transparent and accountable to the American taxpayer. I've had direct conversations with President Zelensky about this, and he knows that we're serious about this. We should increase embassy staffing and enable our diplomats to get out and conduct more oversight of the assistance dollars. More personnel are needed for end-use monitoring of critical weapons systems. And Washington needs to stop telling our team in Ukraine when and where they can go to monitor this. There are currently 64 ongoing or planned audits and reports on U.S. assistance in Ukraine, and so far there has been zero evidence of illicit weapons transfer or misuse of taxpayer dollars. Turning to the Indo-Pacific, I have long said we need better resourcing. I welcome the department's request for increased funding. However, I remain concerned this money will be directed towards promoting the Democrat Party's progressive priorities rather than actually countering China, which is the primary objective. The Biden administration must tell Congress what all this money is for. Right now, without further details, it looks like slush funds for the administration's desires. On Taiwan, I'm troubled, but not surprised that the budget request lacks robust security assistance for Taiwan. Relegating Taiwan to a sliver of $16 million in total FMF funding is unserious and frankly offensive, given the threats emanating from China. Relatedly, in the Middle East, it's clear that the administration is failing to compete with China. I just returned from the region, and the administration's policies across the board have created great great concerns for our partners there. Our partners continually point to an Iran policy that undermines their security, an Afghanistan withdrawal that makes them doubt American commitment, this administration's slow embrace of the Abraham Accords, and increasingly restrictive arms sales, all evidence, they argue, of a retreating America. It's difficult to persuade them otherwise in the face of the evidence. The recent deal between Saudi Arabia, China, and Iran proves the U.S. is sitting on the sidelines. Instead of fixing its approach, the administration blames our partners for this outcome. After all, great power competition is global. As a nation that has fought in both Europe and Pacific, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Focusing on China, it's important. I've said for a long, long time, that doesn't mean we turn our backs on the Middle East. Finally, as you've just returned from Africa, I'd like to hear how you plan to deliver on U.S. commitments on the continent, including those made at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. We can only deliver if we have sufficient personnel and tools to conduct our diplomacy and development effectively. Many issues. I have no doubt you're up to the task of explaining them all to us in detail. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. Mr. Secretary, we'll turn to you. Your full statement will be included in the record without objection. And you got a lot to cover, so I don't want to ultimately constrain your time, but we do want to have a conversation with you. So please, you can commence.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, committee members. Very good to be with you today, as always. And thanks for the opportunity to speak to the administration's proposed FY24 budget for the State Department and the Agency for International Development. We meet at an inflection point, and I think that's reflected actually in what both the Chairman and Ranking Member said. The post-Cold War world era is over, and there is an intense competition underway to determine, to shape what comes next. The United States has a positive vision for the future, a world that is free, that is secure, that is open, that is prosperous. The budget that we're putting forward will help us advance that vision and deliver on issues that are important to most of the American people by preparing us to engage effectively two broad sets of challenges. The first set is posed by our strategic competitors, the immediate acute threat posed by Russia's autocracy and its aggression against Ukraine, and the long-term challenge from the People's Republic of China. The second set is posed by some shared global tests, including the climate crisis, migration, food and energy insecurity, pandemics, all of which have a direct impact on the lives and livelihoods of Americans as well as people around the world. With this committee's leadership and support across two State Department authorization bills, the United States is in a stronger geopolitical position than we were a couple of years ago. We've drawn enormous power from investments we've made in our own economic strength and technological edge at home, including through the Infrastructure Investment Act, through the CHIPS and Science Act, through the Inflation Reduction Act. Our unmatched network of alliances and partnerships has never been stronger. We're expanding our presence in critical regions like the Indo-Pacific, and we're leading unprecedented coalitions to confront aggression and address humanitarian crises around the world. The President's FY24 budget request for the State Department and USAID meet this moment head-on. The budget will sustain our security, economic, energy, and humanitarian support for Ukraine to ensure that President Putin's war remains a strategic failure. The budget will also strengthen our efforts to outcompete the PRC. President Biden and I share the Chairman and Ranking Member's commitment to the Indo-Pacific, which is why this proposal asks for an 18% increase in our budget for that region over FY23. The budget contains both discretionary and mandatory proposals for new innovative investments to outcompete China, including by enhancing our presence in the region and ensuring what we and other fellow democracies have to offer, including things like maritime security, disease surveillance, clean energy infrastructure, digital technology, is more attractive than the alternative. The budget will help us push back on advancing authoritarianism and democratic backsliding by strengthening democracies around the world, including through supporting independent media, countering corruption, defending free and fair elections. And it will allow us to pay our contributions to international organizations because we need to be at the table wherever and whenever new international rules that affect the livelihoods of our people are actually being debated and decided. The budget will allow us to continue leading the world in addressing global challenges from food and energy insecurity to climate and health crises. And on that last point, we're celebrating this week the 20th anniversary of PEPFAR, I think one of the greatest achievements in our foreign policy in recent decades, which has helped save 25 million lives around the world. This budget will help us continue the fight against HIV/AIDS while advancing global health security more broadly through a new Bureau of Global Health Security and Diplomacy, which I look forward to working with Congress to establish this year. The budget will advance our efforts to modernize the State Department, including by expanding our training flow, updating our technology, carrying out diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives, including to make our overseas missions more accessible. I'm grateful for the progress that we've already made together, including Congress's support in updating the Secure Embassy Construction and Counterterrorism Act and Accountability Review Board, which gives us more flexibility to open new missions and to better manage the risks that our people face around the world. We know there's more to do, and we're looking forward to working with Congress to accelerate modernization efforts so that the Department can better attract and retain and support our first-rate workforce as they advance our interests in what is a complex and fast-moving landscape. Finally, the budget will further a priority for me, and I know for many of you, and that is supporting enduring welcome, our whole-of-government effort to resettle our Afghan allies. Keeping our promises to those who serve with us remains an unwavering priority. This budget will help us continue to make good on that commitment. Mr. Chairman, as you referenced, when I began this role, I committed to restoring a real partnership with Congress as an equal partner in our foreign policy making, and I really value tremendously the work that we've done together, the engagements that we've had, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Risch, and look forward to continuing those, and also to working on this budget together as we move forward in the months ahead. So thank you very much for having me here today.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The committee will be in order. The committee will be in order. Committee will be in order. The committee will be in order. The committee will stand in recess until the police can restore order.
If you don't like the Chinese proposal.
It will come back to order. So Senator Risch says it never happened when he was chairman. I don't remember that be the case, but let me just say to our guests, we invite the public to be here so that they can see the proceedings, but there's work being done here, and so we cannot have disruptions of that work. So you're welcome to join us, welcome to see what's happening. I didn't say anything when you lifted your signs, but once you break into a public outcry, you disrupt the proceedings. That is not democracy in action. So we'll continue. Mr. Secretary, we'll start around with 7 minutes. Thank you for your statement. We just saw that Xi Jinping is doubling down on his commitment to support Russia's Vladimir Putin. Xi is no peacemaker. He seems ready to validate Russia's war crimes in Ukraine, require nothing of them to resolve the crisis, except to blame the West and the Ukrainians for having the audacity to put up a fight against an illegal invasion. But in the process, Putin has become Xi's junior partner, because I was looking at those agreements, and they basically largely go one way towards China in terms of investments, but very little in back as it relates to Russia. So, but he needs the international approval that he thinks Xi gives him, and obviously they need each other for a variety of reasons. This is just emblematic of the global strategic challenge that China is to us. We are focused on Ukraine, of course, as Russia continues its illegal assault upon the Ukrainian people and its war crimes. And I appreciate that the administration said crimes against humanity. But our long-term geostrategic challenge is China. How do you think this budget helps us begin to resource that challenge? Because we have more embassies, more personnel in the Chinese Communist Party around the world than we do of our own.
No, I very much appreciate the question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. A few things. First, there are a number of things beyond the budget that we've done to put ourselves in a stronger position to deal with the competition from China. One of the, as I said, are the investments that we've made in ourselves over the last couple of years, which are having a powerful impact around the world as people see that we're serious about our own future. And I point again specifically to chips and science, but as well as some other legislation. Second, we have made a very significant effort to align with allies and partners around the world. And we're seeing that play out in Europe, we're seeing that play out in Asia, in terms of having a more common approach to the challenges posed by China. Having said that, this also needs to be effectively resourced. One of the reasons that we are putting forward a request for mandatory allocations here is because we are facing a generational challenge. And we think that discretionary alone is not enough to help us outcompete China. We have to find, and the budget proposes, some new and innovative ways to provide viable alternatives at scale that discretionary funding does not. So I think if you look at some of the work that we're trying to do, we have a proposal for $400 million to counter specific actions by China that counter our interests in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. $2 billion for high-quality infrastructure projects to more effectively compete with the work that China does that is not just economic, it's strategic in terms of advancing infrastructure. We need to be able, not of course to match them dollar for dollar, which we'll never do, but to be more effective in catalyzing private sector investment and doing it in a more coordinated way with allies and partners. We have investments in Indo-Pacific economies. We have a new DFC fund, which is a critical tool, I think, to leveraging private sector investment. And we have this commitment to the Compacts of Free Association with the Marshall Islands, with Palau, with Micronesia, as well as more broadly with the Pacific Islands, where we are going to significantly increase our presence and engagement, all of which needs to be funded.
I appreciate that. I think we need, and Senator Romney has raised this several times, this is like a whole-of-government perspective. I've asked you about the State Department, but you need a whole-of-government strategy to meet the challenge of China. The CHIPS Act was one element of that the Congress passed last year. I hope we can get a strategic vision from the administration as to all the integrations of an all-of-government approach. These are good elements of that, but we need something broader, and we look forward to working with you on that. I want to turn to Iran for a moment. We have the committee stand in recess. Back to order. I would ask maybe you should ask the million Uyghurs in concentration camps how they feel about that. Let me ask you about Iran. So Iran continues to march on in its fissile materials, about 87% now. Still hasn't come clean with the IAEA about its previous undeclared places. Is providing drones. Yesterday there was an enormous number of strikes against Ukraine by Iranian drones given to the Russians, and obviously they must be getting things from the Russians that they need, particularly in equipment that they need to ultimately achieve some of their goals. We have their oils being exported to countries that are not observing the sanctions. At the end of the day, when are we going to get our European allies to join us in coming to the understanding that we're at a point that despite their best efforts, Iran has not lived up to its obligations to them under the JCPOA, to the international community, and continues to be a challenge?
Mr. Chairman, I actually think they're at that point.
Are they ready to multilateralize sanctions with us?
So, two things. One is, as a result of the effort to get back into mutual compliance with the JCPOA and the fact that Iran rejected what was put on the table by the European Union, by France, by Germany, by the United Kingdom, as well as us, and actually supported at the time by Russia and China, I think that has demonstrated to our partners in Europe that Iran was not serious about genuinely re-engaging on nuclear diplomacy. At the same time, the developments of the last 6 months, to include the provision of drones to Russia for its war of aggression against Ukraine, to include, of course, what's happening in the streets of Iran, the repression of its people. All of that has further concentrated minds in a significant way, including in Europe. We have taken increasingly coordinated actions together with our partners, particularly with regard to sanctions. We continue to do that. We are pushing back with them on the provision of drones and other technologies to Russia, including seeking to break up the networks, trying to get at the dual-use items that go into the manufacturing of these drones. And of course, we are working ourselves to deal with the actions that some of their proxies are taking in the Middle East itself, in Iraq and in Syria.
I just think, Mr. Secretary, that the Europeans have not joined us in multilateralizing our sanctions, which at this time to Iran would have a huge consequence and hopefully change their calculus in a peaceful way. And I just hope we can engage more vigorously with them. I certainly talk to those who come to visit us and parliamentarians from those countries. It's time to come to the conclusion that if we want Iran to move in a different course, others have to join us as well. And I hope we are more robust in that part of the element of how we're dealing with Iran. Senator Risch.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I concur with the Chairman's remarks regarding the Iran situation.
Not on everything? Just on
let's not go overboard here. Okay. He and I met with the IAEA, and I think they're doing a really good job. I really do. I think that there's a different attitude there than there's been in years past, and they are very clear-eyed, and more importantly, they're willing to actually talk about it and say the things that's on their mind about what they're finding and not finding. So, again, we need to encourage our European allies to join us in what we're trying to do as far as Iran is concerned. You're probably aware that here in the Senate, last week and this week and probably next week and maybe after that, we're talking about a potential repeal of the 2002 AUMF. And there's legitimate differences of opinion on this as to whether it should be done completely, whether it should be done partially, and that's all well and good, and we're debating it. Included in that, however, is an attempt to repeal the 2001 AUMF. And I've got a few questions I want to ask you about the 2001 AUMF, and these are just 2001, not the 2002. So the first question I have is the administration currently using the 2001 AUMF legal authorities?
We are.
Second question I have is, in the absence of a new AUMF to replace 2001, is it a vital authority?
In the absence of being able to replace it with something to rely on, yes, it is.
And then lastly, do you think the 2001 repeal should take place before there is an actual replacement of it?
I would hope that if we're moving in that direction, we do this concurrently, which is to say there shouldn't be any gap between the potential repeal of the 2001 authorization and a replacement. We are fully prepared to work with Congress on finding a way, if that's the direction you take, to repeal but replace 2001 with something, if that's the direction of Congress, that is focused, appropriately targeted. But as it stands, we continue to rely on it to make sure that we're protecting the security of Americans who remain under threat from Al-Qaeda, from ISIS-K.
Well, I appreciate that, and
Stop funding the oppression of the public.
Committee will come to order.
The 3.8 billion.
Committee will come to order.
It's a nothing.
Committee will stand in recess until order is restored.
so moving along, I want to talk about the Outcompete China initiative, which I think we're all in agreement on as far as objective is concerned. How we get there, of course, is a matter of debate. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds on budgeting, but this is a budget hearing after all. And the department's seeking a $2 billion mandatory expenditure and $250 million in discretionary funds for that. The $2 billion mandatory funds probably are less likely than anything else. So the question I've got for you is, are you thinking that that there's going to be another, or the administration will be pursuing another supplemental if necessary? Is that the thought process here, or what?
No, Senator. I mean, I can't speak to that at this point. I think it's premature to get to that. The budget is on its own merits our best assessment of the resources we believe we need, absent anything else, to effectively advance the effort to deal with the challenges posed by China.
Yeah, fair enough. And although I think you would agree with me that the $2 billion is in mandatory is going to be tough to do. It's probably going to be a pretty heavy lift for the appropriators. So in that regard, as you know, I wrote to the department asking about expenditure for hard infrastructure, including transport, energy, and digital infrastructure. And I was assured that that was going to happen with the $2 billion. But then the question becomes, if it moves from mandatory over to discretionary, is your view the same, that these expenditures will be for this hard infrastructure as opposed to social kind of programs?
Yeah, I'm certainly determined to do that. We're going to have, you know, some top-line budget challenges depending on how these funds are actually
Fair statement.
apportioned. So, but that would certainly be my determination. Look, to your point, we are in a competition, including on things like hard infrastructure, where they're able to mobilize all of the resources of the state to do it in a way that invests in loss leader projects because it's strategically important to them. Now, we've seen something of a backlash against this in country after country, where it turns out that taking this money is not necessarily leaving countries in the best place. Piling debt on, as we all know, bringing in laborers from China instead of using local workforces, not caring about worker rights, environmental protection, et cetera, bringing corruption with it. So it's been a double-edged sword for a lot of people. Nonetheless, the resources are significant. Our comparative advantage is finding ways to catalyze more effectively private sector investment. We need to be able to do that by putting some of our own money down, equity down. One of the tools, by the way, that you all know so well because you've been instrumental in helping to shape it is the Development Finance Corporation. And we also think it would be very useful to change the way that its equity participation is scored, which makes it very hard for it to provide as much equity investment in projects as it otherwise would. It's the greatest guarantor to others coming in on projects to see a little bit of money on the table from the government. The DFC is an important vehicle for that.
I appreciate that. My time's almost up, but I want to take one quick bite of the apple here on Taiwan.
You must not say terrorism. Listen
Just
to
put into my
our
time.
I noticed, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, it doesn't seem to be directed at you.
No, it doesn't seem to be directed.
All right. So one quick question before I yield here is Taiwan. I was deeply disappointed when I saw what was proposed here. The $16 million is, I mean, it's stunningly. If we're going to pursue the porcupine theory of how to defend Taiwan, I mean, the $16 million doesn't even pay car fare over there. It seems like to me. What are your thoughts on that? We got to do better than that.
No, a few things, and I know this merits a longer conversation. Maybe we can at least start it. So when it comes to Taiwan, we have a couple of things. We appreciate the authority that's been given for foreign military financing. We also appreciate the drawdown authority, which we're looking at how we could effectively use. When it comes to the FMF, what we put in place in the budget is a broader fund, an emerging priorities fund globally. It's about $113 million. But when it comes to Taiwan, what we've been focused on is foreign military sales. And over the course of the last few years, we have done about $5 billion in foreign military sales since the start of this administration, about $10 billion going back to 2019. I have signed out more cases as Secretary of State last year than any previous secretary has done. Taiwan increased its defense budget by about 11%. So it has significant means to acquire this technology. So we're looking at the best ways to get it. One of the challenges we have has little to do with our budgets or our authorities, as I think, again, everyone on this committee knows very well. The long pole in the tent in providing equipment to Taiwan to defend itself is the production capacity here, and this is something, of course, that we're working on. But in terms of both the monies and the authorities, we found that the FMS program in particular is best suited, and there's certainly not been any delay in getting these cases out the door. State Department, I turned them around very, very quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Secretary, welcome back. I want to focus on the Western Hemisphere. The administration's budget request is for $2.7 billion in funding for the hemisphere, and that's a $430 million or 21% increase from the FY22 actual levels. Just a couple of highlights. The largest country or regional level recipients are Central America, $979 million, Haiti, $292 million, and about $275 million is intended for hemispheric efforts to manage migration. In the Central American area, one of the challenges we have is we would like to invest to deal with root causes of immigration, promote stability, economic development, but many of the government partners in that region are not reliable partners. So how do we make an investment of that size, $979 million, or any sizable investment when the partners, the governments there are not reliable?
Yeah, I very much appreciate that, Senator. And the short answer is by, as necessary, working around the governments when we don't have effective partners. Yes, we've got about $1 billion requested in aid for Central America. We have, of course, laws and regulations to ensure that the money is not diverted, for example, to corrupt actors. But at the same time, we want to make sure that it's used effectively to do the things that we want to do, including getting at some of these root causes. Vice President Harris led a major and very successful effort to generate significantly more private sector investment in Central America, a call to action that's produced over $4 billion in commitments from the private sector to invest directly in projects in Central America, which will create opportunity, create jobs for people, and give them, in that sense, a greater opportunity to stay, not to take the hazardous journey to the United States. Now, these things take time to realize, as you know, but we have a lot of work that's going on there. And again, this is not going to the governments. It's going to the private sectors. It's going to implementing partners in terms of our assistance. We would like to be able to work as closely as possible with governments, but unless and until we're satisfied that we can do that in a way that doesn't result in the taxpayers' money being ill-spent, we're going to continue to work directly with NGOs or with the private sector.
Let me just, on the NGO point, for my colleagues and to put it on the record, I'm sure you're grappling with it. Several countries in Central America have either adopted or are considering adopting very stringent laws against foreign NGOs. So some of the very partners with whom we might be able to effectively serve people in the Northern Triangle and other nations are now kind of getting cracked down on by the governments, and this affects not only the NGOs, but even USAID's ability to work with partner agencies. Talk about the impacts of these laws and how you and USAID are attempting to deal with that challenge.
No, you're exactly right, and we've seen that some of these laws are ripped from the playbooks from Russia, China, and other places.
Committee will stand.
Please.
Thank you. No, you're exactly right. As I said, as you said, we've seen different countries, including in our own hemisphere, put forward some of these laws that in very onerous ways restrict and in a practical manner actually end up crippling some of the NGOs and their ability to operate.
So in some nations like Nicaragua, we're not just cracking down on NGOs, but kicking them out of the country.
Yes,
right?
in effect, putting them out of business entirely. That's exactly right. This is also very much part of our own engagement, part of our own diplomacy, and part of the conversation that we have with other countries in the hemisphere who may have better relations with some of these countries than we do, to press them to use the influence that they have to make sure that that space remains open and doesn't get shut down.
Who are the star performers in the region? Because this is a region that really is backsliding in democracy in many ways, but not everyone is backsliding. Some are forward-leaning. So who are some of the star performers in the region in terms of, for example, willingness to call out bad behavior, go to bat for NGOs? It's
very interesting. I think, Senators, you know well, we have countries that have very significant challenges, but a country like Ecuador continues to stand strongly for democratic principles. Chile also speaks up and speaks out in ways that I think are compelling, because it's not exclusively about governments of the right. It goes to governments of the left as well. Those are two countries. But now, of course, we have countries like Costa Rica that it remains a champion.
Costa Rica, for example, together with South Korea, the Netherlands, the United States, and Zambia are 5 of the co-hosts for the upcoming round 2 of the Summit for Democracies.
That's right.
is the administration expecting out of the summit at the end of the month?
Well, what we want to do, and see, and we'll have more to say about that over the next week or so, is to follow up on a lot of the work that was done at the first summit to demonstrate that there are concrete results coming out of these countries coming together. For example, on media protections, which is something else that's under challenge around the world. We've had very concrete initiatives to help defend journalists if they're literally under physical threat, to deal with lawfare that's being used against them to try to put them out of business with frivolous lawsuits coming from governments, funds that we've established to do that. And of course, in the NGO space, pushing back on the tightening of that space. But there are other countries in the hemisphere that have also been very strong partners for us, Dominican Republic on many things, and as well Panama. So while trends have been moving in some directions, I think we continue to see some strong partners that we have a real incentive in working with and trying to bolster.
With a minute left, let me ask you about Haiti. Obviously, we want to engage with other nations. I was in the region recently, a lot of concern about the security situation there. There has to be something to stabilize the security situation before you could get into any meaningful political reform talks, elections, et cetera. Those are not going to happen easily with a security situation that is unstable. Talk a little bit about the U.S. efforts to work with others to promote increased stability in Haiti.
So we have gangs running amok in Haiti and dominating important parts of the capital, Port-au-Prince, as well as other major cities, including ports, transportation networks, terrorizing people in their daily lives, but also, in many cases, aided and abetted by political figures and other leaders who use them for their own purposes. We've been trying to break that nexus, including by sanctioning leaders who we believe are supporting these gangs, to try to break that up. At the same time, we've been working hard to try to bolster the Haitian National Police, along with a number of other countries, so that they can provide the basic security that the state is supposed to be in the business of providing. It is challenging. The HNP is very challenged, but we're engaged along with Canada and some other countries in trying to bolster them up. As you know, there's a very active discussion going on now about whether some sort of international support is needed to really manage the insecurity that Haitians are facing, to get to an election, which Haiti needs because it's basically running out of legitimate actors at this point. It, under present circumstances, would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to hold. So it's something we're very actively working on. The Security Council is also focused on this and seized with this. But I don't want to minimize the challenge. The insecurity, mostly as a result of gangs dominating the situation, is a big problem.
Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I want to start by talking about the United Arab Emirates. As you're aware, in January of January 17th of 2022, the Houthi-backed rebels, or the Houthi rebels backed by the Iranians, launched missiles and drones at Abu Dhabi and killed 3 people, injured 6 others. In our visit there last month, the number of officials in the UAE treated this like their 9/11. They said those words specifically. This was our 9/11. And what they relayed to us was that they're unhappy with regard to the administration's response, that President Biden didn't call. There was a weak response from the United States. In fact, I think it was reported later that you later called Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed and apologized for not having a stronger response. And I can tell you, a year later, they are still very mad that if you did indeed call to apologize, it did not do the trick, because they are still very, very unhappy. So instead of having the opportunity to talk about how we could strengthen our relationship with the UAE and how we might be able to make sure that we've got a strong relationship versus the Chinese Communist Party, we were instead lectured about this fumbled in diplomacy. And again, this just leads to our allies in the region looking for other help. And we've seen that recently, for example, with what the CCP is doing. Obviously, we've all read in the newspapers about Saudi Arabia and Iran agreeing to establish diplomatic relations with the help of the CCP brokering that deal, which I think we all agree makes us look bad. So, first of all, let's just start with, how did it happen that we didn't call the Crown Prince and have President Biden call him. I don't expect that that would be President Biden who would be thinking those things up. That shouldn't somebody on his team be telling him, hey, you need to give Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed a phone call?
Senator, thank you. In fact, I spent, not just on the phone, I spent 2.5, 3 hours in person with Mohammed bin Zayed actually in Morocco. This goes back to last year. We had a very lengthy discussion about this moment. And I agree with you that for our Emirati partners and friends, this was a profound moment. And I certainly heard from him what you just shared, the concern that we had not adequately engaged them. Now, I will tell you that other partners in the government did reach out immediately to our counterparts, in my case, the foreign minister. If you ask the Secretary of Defense, he will tell you about the assets that we deployed immediately to bolster the Emirates' security. He'll tell you as well that the technology that was used to shoot down the incoming was American technology that we provided. Nonetheless, I'm deeply sensitive to the way this was perceived by our friends, and my own conversations with MBZ made it clear that we understood and that we would be with them and stand with them against threats to their security. Since then, we have been working on negotiating a strategic framework agreement to, in very concrete ways, address some of the concerns they have, to answer some of the questions they have about their security. And we've done a lot of work on that and made, I think, some very, very good progress. We've worked very closely together in building out the Abraham Accords. We started something together called the Negev Forum, along with Israel, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with Egypt, that we all took part in. We put something together that I think is going to bear very good results, bringing together the Emirates, Israel, India, and the United States, something we call I2U2, to jointly invest in infrastructure projects, and the first ones are going forward in India. We've made clear that in terms of some of the weapon systems that they seek for their security, we are fully prepared to move forward. These are systems that they started to discuss previously. They pushed the pause button. We said we'd welcome pursuing these conversations, including the F-35s. So I think there are a whole variety of things that are going on in the relationship to demonstrate the seriousness that we attach to the partnership and our commitment to it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and it's an important relationship. So I encourage you to continue, because I can tell you, having just been there last month, they are still not happy. This is still a very sore spot for them. There's more that we need to do to make sure we can strengthen this relationship. So, and I encourage you to figure out ways to not let this happen again to one of our key allies, where if a call from the president is going to be important, that, I view this as the State Department, and you as the head of the State Department's responsibility to make sure the president's informed about making these types of phone calls. Next, I'd like to move on to the effectiveness of the sanctions in Russia. Early in February 2022, President Biden warned Vladimir Putin that he has never seen sanctions like the one I have promised to impose. And soon after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the West did impose tough sanctions, including measures that included the removal of the Russian banks from the SWIFT network, sanctions on Russia's central bank, freezing $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves, among other things. And the expectation of this, that this would cripple the Russian economy. In April, or the World Bank predicted by April 2022, Russia's economy would be contracting by 11.2%. The International Institute of Finance went even further, predicting the Russian economy would decline by a whopping 15%. Instead, the Russian economy was weakened, but it certainly was not crippled, having shrunk maybe 2 to 4% last year, much less than the 10 to 15% that people were predicting. My question is, what did we miss? First, the ability for Russians to sanction-proof its economy, as well as actions taken by the Russian central bank to implement aggressive capital control measures and interest rate hikes to prevent the collapse of the ruble. Second, Russia would still be able to sell oil that would have gone to Europe to countries like China and India. And in fact, India imports of Russian oil are up 400%, as you know. And then third, the ability of Russia to circumvent these sanctions. For example, Turkish companies exported tens of millions of dollars worth of machinery, electronics, spare parts, and other items that Russia needs for its military. Countries that border Russia, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, have become primary importers of dual-use goods from the West and then reselling them in Russia. And this week, the New York Times reported that China has sold more than $12 million in drones for Russia that they'll use in the war effort. So clearly we have to do better. So in March last year, you said that Western sanctions are having a crippling effect on the Russian economy. After a year of conflict in Ukraine, do you believe that these are crippling? And if not, what more do we need to do to sanction Russia?
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. Two things on this. First, Russia did take extraordinary measures, for example, to prop up the ruble, the expenditures from its sovereign wealth fund as well to make sure it was propping up its economy. That certainly had some effect on some of the macro numbers. But as I see it, the sanctions, the export controls are having and will have an increasingly powerful effect on Russia's ability to prosecute modern warfare, to develop its economy, to progress in its technology, to acquire and use energy extraction technology that it needs, to modernize its aerospace and defense sectors. All of these things are being dramatically undercut by the sanctions and by the export controls. Yes, it is finding some substitute parts for things that are being denied by dozens of countries around the world. Those parts are inferior. It's having tremendous difficulty in replacing the weapons that it's expending, particularly precision-guided munitions in Ukraine, actually replacing those, getting the parts to do that, and a combination of things along with the sanctions and export controls, including the exodus of nearly 1 million Russians, many of whom are the most educated, most technologically sophisticated. The fact that 1,000 or more international companies have left Russia, don't want to do business there. All of these things taken together, never mind the fact that horrifically some 200,000 Russians, by public estimates, have either been killed or wounded in Ukraine. All of these things will have growing and powerful effects on Russia's ability both to continue to have a modern, effective military and to have a modern, effective economy going forward. So I have no doubt about the powerful impact of these sanctions.
Do we need to do more, though?
We are working every single day, not just us, but in very close coordination with dozens of countries around the world. The European Union has now done, I think, 10 different sanctions packages on Russia. This is something no one would have expected. We have ourselves continue to look at the different actors that we can go after, the different sectors that we can go after to have an impact. And I think, again, you're going to see this increasing the threat. They are having tremendous difficulty replacing the equipment that they've been using up. And they are looking, you're right, they are looking at different places around the world, but it's not at all the same as what they had before.
Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. We've just witnessed a 3-day bro fest with Putin and Xi celebrating authoritarian power. China certainly running over the top of Hong Kong, and of course we're very concerned about its threat to Taiwan. Russia assaulting Ukraine and trying to take it in just a brutal display of force. How much should the American public be concerned about the way these authoritarian leaders are approaching the world?
Well, on one level, this is no surprise. Both countries have very different worldviews than our own. They may find common cause in opposing the worldview that we and so many other countries around the world seek to defend and advance. Before the Russian aggression against Ukraine, you'll remember that they had President Xi and President Putin had a meeting in which they declared a partnership with no limits or limitless friendship, depending on how you translate it. And to some extent, we continue to see that play out. I think in many ways with Russia now as the very junior partner in this relationship, but a partner that may serve some interests that China has. But what we've done at the same time is to make a major reinvestment, rejuvenation, re-energizing of our own alliances and partnerships. And we now have much greater convergence than we had a couple of years ago on how to approach both of these challenges. You see that in the coalition that's come together to oppose the Russian aggression against Ukraine, both in terms of the support for Ukraine and the pressure being exerted against Russia. You see that in the work that countries are doing together to deal with some of the challenges that China poses. We have with European partners, Asian partners, much greater convergence on everything from investment screening mechanisms to export controls to outward investment.
Thank you, and I'm quite impressed by the way we've responded. But I do think that the circumstances regarding Hong Kong, Ukraine, and China's use of high tech to suppress the Uyghurs are very appealing strategies to many authoritarian leaders. And we have decades ahead in which we're going to be struggling for the vision of democracy and human rights versus the authoritarian power. One of the things that both Russia and China have been engaged in is transnational repression. And last week I introduced a bill with Senators Rubio, Cardin, and Haggerty, a comprehensive bill. You may not have had a chance to look it over yet, but certainly it's trying to lay out a roadmap for us to respond to transnational repression. And I just want to keep raising this as a growing threat to citizens inside our own country, and also the concern about how they are working to extradite people back to China or Russia with grave consequences.
Yeah, we very much share that concern and really welcome working with you, the other members, on that legislation.
I will be leading a congressional delegation to Vietnam and Indonesia here shortly at the beginning of April, and we'll be going to Jakarta to have conversations with ASEAN, given that that's where their capital is right now. And how do you evaluate how successful ASEAN will be in being a significant part of the structure that kind of resists Chinese expansionist power?
I think we're seeing increased concern among a number of countries in ASEAN for some of the exertions of power and influence that China is displaying, particularly, for example, when it comes to the maritime claims that they're making that are in contradiction with international law. Some of the actions that the Chinese vessels of one kind or another are taking, and we see this play out on a regular basis. So we're very much engaged, for example, with the ASEAN countries as well as with other countries in helping to build up what's called maritime domain awareness, helping to give them the tools to have much greater visibility on what's going on in their own seas, to be able to see in real time any kind of aggressive actions being taken, to be able to see in real time the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing that is devastating livelihoods in many of these countries where China is one of the principal actors. So I think you're seeing a real significant awareness of some of these challenges, and we're taking practical steps to try to help countries address it.
Thank you. I'm going to shift to Central America. A few years ago, I went down with Tom Carper to assess the challenges, and we found the 3 C's, if you will. We found the cartels, we found the corruption, and we found climate change, all driving really a disintegration of the economy and livability, which were driving factors of folks deciding to take the risky journey north. We have a new opportunity with the new president, well, not so new now, but of Honduras, President Castro. How's that going?
We've been engaged with President Castro under administration. I think, by the way, as you know, the former president of Honduras is awaiting trial in the United States for corruption, among other things. We're working to engage these governments, whether it's Honduras, whether it's Guatemala, whether it's El Salvador. There are challenges posed by some of the policies that the governments are pursuing, but we're working to find ways to engage with them on issues of clearly mutual concern to us. So we're working on that on a regular basis.
Well, it's always helpful to have a new opportunity, but it's very difficult for a president alone to change policy when things are deeply embedded, and the cartels are very embedded, and corruption is very much there, and climate change is not going away. So a lot to overcome. Going across to Burma, I led a congressional delegation years ago when Aung San Suu Kyi invited us to come and see that there was nothing to hide. And then at the last moment, she and her team blocked our ability to see the some 300 villages that had been burned and razed. And then since then, we've had the military take over, and things have been perhaps even worse. And we always hope that there's some kind of path back to democracy, back to some form of human rights, but it's not looking too good. Any ways you can make me feel better about this?
I wish that I could, but unfortunately I share your assessment. We have been working since the military takeover to do a number of things, including, of course, first and foremost, stopping the violence, which continues to take place every single day, and that's gotten worse, to release prisoners, and to get back on the path of democracy. None of that has happened. We've been working with many other countries to try to exert pressure on the military regime. We have by the way, we have the Burma Act as well, whose passage we appreciate and welcome. We're working to implement it. Part of that goes to the support that we're providing to democratic groups in Burma, as well as ethnic groups that are dealing with the repression coming from the military junta, trying to prepare them effectively for governance. And at the same time, we continue to ramp up economic actions against the regime. We've designated, I think to date, about 80 individuals, some 30 or 40 entities, military leaders, business affiliates, arms dealers, energy companies that are supporting the regime in an effort to exert some meaningful pressure to move them back to the democratic path. You were talking about ASEAN a minute ago. Of course, we've been strongly encouraging the ASEAN five-point consensus for them to actually implement it in a meaningful way. That's been very challenging. In short, I wish that I had something positive or hopeful to say. In this moment, it's an incredibly challenged situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Paul.
On September 12th and November 7th of last year, I sent letters to the State Department asking for records about coronavirus research that had been funded by the State Department. The State Department refused to comply. When Assistant Secretary Sherman came, I asked her the same question. She didn't seem to be aware that you had been funding coronavirus research, but you are. And I got the "I'll get back to you" line. A couple weeks later, I met personally with you at the State Department and asked you the same question. Will you not divulge to us the records of the State Department's support for coronavirus research, particularly in China? You assured me you would help. We communicated several times over the phone with another Assistant Secretary of State who finally sent us a letter and said, no, we're not going to give you anything. So that's where we stand. And it's my question is, what's the State Department hiding? Why won't you give these records to the American people?
Senator, thank you. And yes, I appreciated you raising this when we saw each other a month or so ago. And my understanding is that our teams have been working to find an accommodation. There's longstanding practice.
We got a refusal, blanket refusal. No, they are not going to give us the records.
We cannot directly provide the
Sure you can.
unredacted cables. We have a longstanding practice with this committee about how we do
You're
things.
you're refusing to release them.
No, but
it's
I
not that
think-
you can't. There's a difference between can and may. You won't do it, but you can do it.
My hope is that we can find a way forward that answers your concerns so that you get the information that you're looking for. My understanding is that our teams have been working on that, and I commit to continue to do that so we can get you the
We're talking about unclassified material. Most of this is unclassified. And so we just had a unanimous vote in the Senate and in the House, and President Biden just signed a bill saying he's going to declassify stuff. But if you declassify it and you still hide it from the American people, that's a problem. I mean, we spend all of this time lambasting authoritarians, and for lack of transparency, we have these silly networks on TV that are aligned with the Democrat Party saying democracy's under attack. Well, do you think transparency has something to do with democracy? You're refusing to give records on research. Money that went for research. We want to read the research grant proposals. We want to read what the people in Wuhan sent back to the State Department saying they did. Which viruses did they create? Because the thing is it sounds all great. We're going to identify all the viruses of the world. But part of what they do is they take a virus they found 200 feet down in a cave, and they mix it with another virus to create a virus that doesn't exist in nature, because they say that's how we're going to further identify it. There's a big debate that should be had whether that's safe. To take a virus from 100 feet down a bat cave, 12 hours south of Wuhan, and take it to a city of 10 million. And yet you won't help us investigate this. You refuse, and it is reminiscent of the countries we criticize for lack of transparency, and yet you sit there and say you're still going to continue to refuse.
Senator, I think there are very important debates that certainly go beyond my knowledge and expertise, for example, on gain of function that I know there's a vigorous debate about whether the risk outweighs the reward. I don't have the expertise to know that. And
But how do we have oversight or investigate it if you won't give us a record?
so the program that, in this instance, USAID was involved in was not engaged in gain of function work or gain of
That's a
function.
debate,
But
and that's your opinion. We'd like to see the records.
so,
Fauci says there was no gain of function in Wuhan, and nobody believes him anymore.
you know, again, there's I think, an important debate about this. As I recall, during the Obama administration, there was actually a moratorium put on.
I
gain
know,
of
but it
function
isn't
work.
the debate. I
That
don't want to
mor-
have that debate with you. I only want to have the
Again,
records.
I believe that we can find a way to get you the information that you're looking for.
All right, but the last response we have from you is no. So the American public needs to know. I've asked many, many times. I've asked you in person. This is the second time in person. I've talked to 2 assistant secretaries of state, and the writing we get back from you is no. Not maybe, not we'll work with you, it's no. So that's where
Senator,
we are now.
No, and it's not no, just to be clear. We did reach back out to your team just as recently as this week to offer to provide all of that information in briefing form, which is to say,
Which
we
means
will
you
share the
get to
information.
read it and interpret it and spin it, and we get to hear your spin. We don't want to hear your spin.
We're-
We want to look at the doc. We're talking
We're
about
not in-
grant.
we're not in
We're
the
talking
business.
about grant proposals. You act as if we're talking about the secrets of the Manhattan Project. We're talking about grant proposals, and we're talking about grant updates where someone has to write in and say, "Oh, we did this experiment and this experiment, we got this result." That's what we're talking about. Same thing from NIH, same thing from HHS. Everybody's hiding it. And it's not even really something to protect the Biden administration. Most of this stuff happened in the previous administration. But I don't get it. Why circle the wagons? Maybe there's nothing to see here, but then it makes the whole world think you're hiding something if you won't give it to us.
Yeah, and this
So
goes-
just give it to us. It's a bunch of bureaucratic paper that we're looking to sift through to see if there are any clues, because one of the biggest clues we have that they did this is they asked DARPA, and we only know this through a whistleblower, they asked DARPA for money to take a coronavirus and put a furin cleavage site in it to make it more infectious. And lo and behold, that's what COVID-19 is. It looks just like what they said they wanted to create with our money. And we turned them down, but that doesn't mean they didn't do the research. We're looking for research like that they were performing. We're looking for something that may be in their notes that hasn't been public, that hasn't been sifted through. But what we feel is that people at State Department and at NIH and HHS are conflicted. Why? Because if you funded research that somehow is linked to the pandemic or a leakage of that, that doesn't look so good for the people who funded it. So we see this as a circling of the wagons and a conflict of interest that maybe there are people within the State Department who funded research who are worried that it might be linked to the pandemic. But we can't just accept your spin on it because people there may be self-interested, the people who funded the program. We're just asking to look at the data, but so far it has been no. We've had a few phone calls, but we don't want your spin on it. We want to look at the documents ourselves.
We're not providing spin. As I said, I believe we can provide the information you're looking for. We have longstanding practices and procedures in terms of actually providing documents and cables with this committee that we're not prepared to change. But in terms of getting you the information you're looking for,
And the only cables we have that are of value, we got leaked to us, or actually they were declassified by the Trump administration. Those cables said, and these were from some State Department
Yep.
folks, and it was amazing, and I don't actually fault anybody for missing it. I'm sure there are thousands of cables, but in 2018 or 17, they were sending cables back saying, holy you-know-what. They're over here working without gloves in unsafe conditions in a BSL-2 that should be a BSL-4, not a very safe condition, and that's why some of our intelligence people have leaned towards this coming from a lab. Why wouldn't you want to help us? Why wouldn't everybody want to help us?
I've seen those cables. You're right. They've come out, and I think what they said, at least as I read them, was that there were concerns based on State Department officials
But we
visiting
only
the lab,
know
that
those
there were
because
not a
someone
number
had
of
the
sufficiently
gumption to
trained State
declassify them. And I'll end with this because I know my time's up. Mr. Chairman, it takes one signature. He'll give all this stuff to me tomorrow if you'll sign a document, because he says he won't sign it unless the chairman of a committee does it, and he's hiding behind some ruse. There is no law saying this. He could do it if he wants, but he's hiding behind some opinion that his own administration makes the rules to say they won't give it to Congress. But if you'll help me, we can get the information tomorrow. Everything he's saying won't give me, he will give me tomorrow if you'll sign a letter.
I appreciate, the senator's time has expired, but I appreciate your concern. I understand that my committee counsel has spoke to your counsel this past Monday, and your counsel followed up with us today, and we are in pursuit of trying to see how you can be accommodated, and I look forward to making that happen. Senator Barrasso.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Appreciate it. I want to start with China being labeled as a developing country. Today, I led a group of 21 senators, it's a bipartisan group, introducing legislation to end lending to China through the multilateral development banks. You know, since 2016, China has received about $23 billion from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. American taxpayers, we are the largest contributor to these banks. And it's completely unacceptable to me for Americans to be subsidizing loans to China. The administration continues to allow American taxpayer dollars to go to the Chinese Communist Party. I believe it needs to end. Not another dime should be approved. You know, these banks are designed to assist developing countries. And China is no longer a developing country. It was years and years ago when some of these international organizations were put into place, but the designation hasn't changed. You know, China is the second largest economy in the world, clearly has the financial resources, the access to capital to meet its own needs without assistance from the international community. But the Chinese Communist Party continues to exploit this outdated label as a developing country to get these preferential treatments and loans. It's, as a developing country, quote, developing country, China also receives funds from international bodies, mostly paid for by American taxpayers. China just got $1.4 billion from the multilateral fund at the Montreal Protocol, which was from back in the 80s. So let's be clear, this money moving from America to China, to me, is making China stronger and America weaker. And, you know, and this is at the time when China is blatantly flying spy balloons over the nation, stealing intellectual property, sending fentanyl and other opioids into the U.S., increasing military aggression. You know, we've got the whole list. So it just seems that China is playing the international community as well as our own administration as fools. Their goal is simple. They want to be the world dominant power. So do you believe that China still qualifies as a developing country? And, you know, why should American taxpayers be supporting lending and financial assistance that goes to China?
Senator, I very much appreciate the point. I wanted, on that specific question, I really have to defer to my colleagues at the Treasury Department. What I can tell you is this. I certainly see, as a general matter, China continuing to raise the banner of developing country in a variety of places that doesn't reflect the reality. Another part of this that I think is very important is on debt relief, where countries around the world that turn out to owe a lot of money principally to China and then desperately need relief. We're also a creditor. Countries in Europe are creditors, and elsewhere. The Chinese continue to insist on being treated differently, in the technical parlance, not taking the same haircut that everyone else is willing to take. That's unsustainable. Yeah. And in fact, in Sri Lanka recently, where we needed to help Sri Lanka get out of the devastating debt situation it was in, we came together and insisted that no one else would provide the relief unless China similarly treated its debt. So I agree with you that these are important things we have to work out. On the specific question, though, I really have to defer to the Treasury Department.
Yeah, because we are giving subsidized loans to a country that then turns around and can use this money to engage in predatory lending to developing nations, as you've described. Mm-hmm. So next, in terms of, I want to turn to European energy security. Mm-hmm. Europe has learned some really hard lessons following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. None are clearer than the need to have access to affordable and dependable supply of energy. So affordable, dependable. Mm-hmm. The word's not renewable, it's affordable, available, reliable energy. Russia's demonstrated over and over again its willingness to use energy as a weapon, continue to do that. The world has seen Russia threaten our allies and our partners with natural gas. Europeans understand the crucial importance of increasing U.S. oil and natural gas production and exports to them from here. Unfortunately, President Biden has not necessarily followed that path because of his approach on the issue of climate and carbon. So do you support increasing exports of American liquefied natural gas to help our allies and partners escape this dependence on Russia?
I do, and we have. Our exports to Europe of liquefied natural gas over the last years went up 140%. We made a commitment to Europeans, to our partners, in dealing with the aggression against Ukraine to do whatever we could to provide for their energy security as they worked to move away from that dependence. By the way, as you know, they've done actually remarkable things just in the space of a year to try to end that dependence, both in terms of gas and in terms of oil. But we dramatically increased our LNG exports here. Some of it we redirected from Asia. Some of it was a result of increased production. Oil production itself went up 11%, and that is a result of the policies that we pursued.
So then you agree Europe is much better off buying energy resources from the United States than having to buy it from our adversaries?
Absolutely.
Great. Wanted to talk about fentanyl. I mean, I'm from Wyoming. You'd think, well, how much fentanyl could be going there is not close to the border, but every state is a border state. Well, Wyoming has seen an astronomical increase in the amounts of death related to fentanyl. Our Division of Criminal Investigation, just in 2020, seized about 1,600 dosage units. This past year, 13,000 units, so a 13-fold increase in just a couple of, and that was only for 3/4 of the year. So what can we be doing more to work with the government of Mexico to stop the importation of fentanyl precursors from China?
Senator, I could not agree with you more. I think this is among the top, if not the top, challenges that we face. As you know well, the single biggest killer of Americans aged 18 to 49 is fentanyl, synthetic opioids. And we seized last year enough fentanyl to kill every American. So this is right at the top of the list. So just a few things. I think we have a comprehensive approach to this problem. Obviously, there's work that we're doing at home just to protect our own people in terms of trying to reduce demand, treatment, antidotes, et cetera. But what is critical are a few things. First, border security in itself. We have the technology that is being deployed more effectively now to the border to much better detect the fentanyl that's coming into the United States from Mexico. 96% of it is coming through ports of entry. The screening technology that's being deployed, that will make a difference. We're working with Mexico to disrupt the cartels. Mexico has actually taken, with our support, significant action to arrest and to disrupt the cartels, the criminal enterprises that are engaged in this, to shut down the labs, to go after the leaders. And then, at the same time, there's another aspect of this problem that goes beyond Mexico. One of the challenges, and it goes to China, among other countries, one of the challenges is the diversion of licit precursors into the illicit production of fentanyl. There is a lot that we are doing to try to rally the world to deal with this problem. And so, for example, voluntary agreements among countries and companies, because the private sector is critical, to share information, to better label products, to make sure that you know your customer when you're shipping a chemical that's legal, but then is being diverted. All of these things are making a difference. For the very first time, I just came from the G20 foreign ministers meeting. For the first time, the United States got this on the G20 agenda. This is important because those countries, the wealthiest economies in the world, are the very ones, along with their private sectors, that can make a big difference. We're putting all of this together. We have, with the Mexicans, a joint synthetic drug action plan that we agreed to last year that is intensely focused on synthetic opioids, notably fentanyl. By the way, one of the other things that's happening, I'll be quick, is the Mexicans themselves are feeling the brunt of this, which is to say not only have they been a country where this is being made in and shipped through, but more and more Mexicans, unfortunately, are falling victim to synthetic opioids. So their feelings, I've spoken to President López Obrador about this directly. He's seized with this. We are doing a lot in partnership with them to disrupt, to take these cartels down.
Let me just end with this, Mr. Chairman, and may put this to you in writing. But last week, the U.S. Border Patrol, because you mentioned border security, the Border Patrol Chief Ortiz testified before a House Homeland Security Committee hearing in McAllen, Texas. He was pointedly asked whether or not the Department of Homeland Security had operational control of the border, and the Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol said, no, sir. So, thank you.
The only thing I'd just add, if I could, Senator, is just in the case of fentanyl, I'm not speaking to the larger issue. What we really have to bear down on, and I think, it's not my direct area expertise, but based on what I know, on the border itself, as I said, about 95% of this is coming through the legal ports of entry. It's being smuggled in through those ports, not at points along the border. We do have technology that's much more effective than we've had to be able to detect it. You know, it's under the seats of cars, buried in trucks.
We've all had the
Yeah.
tour and seen what they've described.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
President López Obrador, fentanyl is not produced in Mexico. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for appearing here today. The meeting earlier this week of the leaders of our two main strategic competitors demonstrates the continued urgency of our nation having a diplomatic corps that is second to none. I thank you for your efforts to make this a reality and look forward to engaging more to support our ongoing progress towards this goal. I want to start with my concern with the PRC's actions across the Indo-Pacific, from the Mekong River to the South China Sea to the Pacific Island nations. And it's no secret that the PRC is using economic coercion and expanding their diplomatic presence in this key area. And reality dictates that countries in this region cannot ignore the PRC's presence and proximity. And yet, I still hear from our allies and partners about how the United States remain a strong partner of choice. And you've mentioned this before. I also hear from Southeast Asian partners specifically about how central ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is to their regional identity and as a shield against dominance by foreign powers. My colleague, Senator Merkley, mentioned the importance of ASEAN and the roles that it plays beyond an economic organization. For example, the work that it is doing to hold Burma accountable for the fine points concerns. And in February, I led a CODEL to Jakarta to engage with ASEAN as an institution and with the Indonesia bilaterally. There I saw firsthand the eagerness of our partners for more, not less, U.S. engagement, particularly on economic affairs. Secretary Blinken, can you provide a candid analysis of your department's relationship-building initiatives with key allies and partners in Southeast Asia, particularly with organizations like ASEAN, and in particular ASEAN itself, and explain how this budget will improve our ability to advance our Indo-Pacific objectives?
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the question. First, just very quickly, as you know very well, this is a critical area for us. We've got 50% of the world's population in the Indo-Pacific. We've got 60% of its GDP. We have a region that is driving basically 75% of economic growth over the last 5 or 6 years. So this is vital to us. As it happens, China invests about 50% of its assistance programs and its economic and diplomatic resources in the Indo-Pacific. So we have to be there, first and foremost, and that goes to the efforts that we're doing, and the chairman referenced it at the start. We may not be able to match China person for person, but we're going to be engaged in ways that we haven't been. We're significantly increasing our diplomatic presence in the Pacific Islands. As you know, we've opened in the Solomon Islands. We're looking at other embassies in Tonga and in Kiribati. And at the same time, we have very significantly re-engaged ASEAN, including President Biden, having an extraordinary summit meeting with the ASEAN countries precisely because we think it's an important institution for working together to deal with some of these challenges. At the same time, this goes back to the budget, we want to make sure that we're appropriately resourced so that when it comes to countries throughout the region that have interests and have needs and may be looking to us to be a strong partner, we actually have something to offer. And it's less about, as I said, forcing them to choose. It's more about giving them a choice. And the budget is really designed in that way when it comes, for example, to having the resources to invest coherently in infrastructure, to dealing with building climate resilience and adaptation. The Pacific Island countries, of course, some of them literally at risk of no longer existing if they're not able to deal with that. We have the programs in place, and the budget supports that to be able to do that. But also their own diplomatic and political weight is important, and marshaling that on a given problem, whether it's Burma or whether it's some of the actions that China engages in that they don't like and we don't like, there is much more power and effectiveness in engaging these issues together than there is any one of these countries doing it alone. That's why ASEAN itself is important. One of the things that they've worked on for years, as you know, with China is a code of conduct in the maritime space. I think China's been dragging that along for a long time. We tried to help reinforce that. For example, the State Department put out last year the definitive legal analysis of all of the maritime claims to basically help countries push back against some of the egregious assertions by China in their maritime space. In very practical ways, as I mentioned earlier, we're working to give them the tools and resources to have better what's called maritime domain awareness. They have better visibility on their own seas and oceans, for example, to detect illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, which is devastating economies and livelihoods in a large part of the region. So across a whole series of things, we are working together, and the budget attempts to reflect the importance of that work.
Does the budget include an increase to our mission to ASEAN?
I don't know if it actually has an increase in what's needed for the mission. I believe that we're appropriately resourced, but let me come back to you on that. And if you've identified any deficiencies, I'm happy to hear them. We sent someone very experienced, very close to the president, to be our representative to ASEAN, and who was the executive secretary of the National Security Council, who's been doing a terrific job. I've engaged repeatedly in person, as well as, of course, remotely with all of our ASEAN colleagues and with ASEAN itself.
And I would hope that our ambassador to ASEAN is given all the tools he needs to do the job, and I don't think he has all the resources that he needs. So I would love to review the budget with you on that. Thank you. Can you also elaborate more? You touched on this, how the economic initiatives in the budget include both newer initiatives such as Outcompete China and the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, as well as ongoing efforts like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework will advance our policy goals in the Indo-Pacific region. Drill down a little bit more. I know I'm getting into the weeds, but I'm very interested.
No, I think it's important. So we have a number of programs that we propose to fund in the budget to counter some of the challenges posed by China in the region. For example, on supply chain dominance, one of the things that we put together is something called the Mineral Securities Partnership, where we're pooling information and pooling resources with a number of other countries to be able to invest ourselves in critical minerals so that they're not dominated by any one country. We're working to build much greater supply chain resiliency, particularly among countries in that region. We have now about 17 economies that are part of this process to prevent near-term disruptions, to make sure that we develop early warning signals in case our supply chains are disrupted. And of course, more fundamentally, helping these countries build out a significant amount of infrastructure. We're doing that through some of the funding we have in the budget for the Asia-Pacific. We also more broadly have something that the President established with the G7 called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And that really runs the gamut. We've been able to generate investments, starting with government resources, but primarily getting the private sector to invest. We were the catalyst for it, in everything from Brazil nickel and cobalt mining to the Indonesian energy transition, a $20 billion investment in helping them make a transition, upgrading telecom networks in the Pacific Island countries, mobilizing investment capital for internet service providers in the region, as well as in Africa and Latin America, setting up vaccine manufacturing in Senegal, and rail linkages among countries in Africa, all of which deals with some of the challenges that China has posed in being able to have the field to itself in many of these areas. No longer the case. But there's an intense focus in the budget on the Indo-Pacific, more specifically, including a fund to focus infrastructure investment in the region.
Thank you. Wow, 7 minutes goes quick, Mr. Chairman, or 8 minutes.
It does when you're covering the world, or even a very specific part of the world. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you.
The CHIPS and Science Act established an International Technology Security and Innovation Fund. I know you're familiar with it, ITSE, at the State Department to promote international 5G communication security and to secure our semiconductor supply chains. Our long-term national security and economic competitiveness hinge on these two critical technologies. First, I want to thank you and your staff for their hard work on these critical topics. I was encouraged to hear that the U.S. was first to engage with our allies to secure critical semiconductor minerals and to create additional downstream packaging capacity. In my view, the first mover advantage further emphasizes the importance of the CHIPS and Science Act. Mr. Secretary, can you describe the strategic impact it would have if the ITSE fund is fully resourced? Looking forward toward the next 5 years of this fund, what are your goals for this program, if you could discuss that, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Well, Senator, thank you. And as you know, I think that with your leadership, what Congress was able to do in putting together the CHIPS and Science Act is one of the most important achievements we've had in our ability to compete effectively, particularly with China. And by the way, when I go around the world, this is one of the things I hear from country after country. They are very well aware of CHIPS and science, and they appreciate it. I think one of the great merits from our perspective is the fact that under the Act you provided funding over 5 years. So it's very predictable for us to really do two things: to shore up semiconductor supply chains, downstream and upstream, and also to make sure on the telecommunications side that we are helping countries put in place networks and infrastructure using trusted vendors and making sure that and advancing technology like ORAN that really is the future and again is necessary to making sure that they're not dealing with untrusted vendors. So we have, as you know, and I know our teams have been working very closely together, mapped out how we would use both prongs of the fund. That is the semiconductor prong and the information communications technology prong, making sure that we're getting the upstream inputs and providing the critical minerals that are needed for our own fabs that were now being built to actually make the chips, a market that, as you know better than anyone, the PRC currently dominates, but that now we have an ability to make real inroads on. Policy coordination among fab nations, usually important, and we're seeing that really come to fruition. We basically can't have countries leaking technology as fast as they can make it, and I think this fund gives us the resources to do that. Expanding downstream capacity, as you mentioned, in a very significant way, and then the data mapping piece of this. We're mapping the supply chains, we're mapping all the entities involved to ensure that we are targeting them to best effect. And as I said, on the telecommunications side of things, developing, strengthening, expanding international enabling environments for these secure networks and deploying ICT networks and services in partner countries, being able to go at with a real alternative, 5G coming from other places with something like ORAN driving down the costs, providing more secure networks. And all of this mapped out over 5 years because we've got the predictable funding that is being provided.
Thank you for that. I think it'll be real helpful if, on an ongoing basis, members of this committee, and I know my office has been working very closely with your team, but if we were made privy to goals and any adjustments that may be made and maybe give us some visibility into the internal tools like supply chain mapping that you're using to track progress towards those goals. So,
be happy to do that.
Thank you. And relatedly, how are you working with Secretary Raimondo to align the priorities of your respective departments as it relates to CHIPS and science implementation?
I'd say the best description is hand in glove. I'm not sure who's the hand, who's the glove, but hand in glove. For example, the Secretary and I together convened a couple of dozen countries at the minister level, Commerce Secretary, Foreign Minister level, on supply chains, on building out resilience, diversification, nearshoring, friendshoring. One of the things that came out of that ministerial, it's an ongoing process, is putting in place now an early warning system among these countries for any supply chain disruptions when it comes to, for example, critical minerals, anything going into a semiconductor. So that's the result directly of the work that our two departments and we personally have done together.
Is there anything else Congress can do at this point to assist you in your efforts with respect to CHIPS and science implementation?
I think, as it stands, our budget reflects what we need. But what I want to do, if I can, is just come back and make sure I'm giving you the most considered response possible in case I'm missing anything, because this is too important not to get right.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, your staff identified the critical role that civilian, foreign law enforcement, and military personnel play in establishing secure communication networks. Congress provided the authority through the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership and the Economic Support Fund to work with all of these groups with FY23 funds, but not, as I understand it, for the rollover of earlier funds. I look forward to working with my colleagues, particularly those on the State and Foreign Ops Subcommittee, to provide the necessary budgetary authority to continue this important work. Is that something you would endorse?
Unless I'm missing something, I'd welcome that. I don't know if there is something in place that has us covered that I'm not aware of, but at least as described, it's something I'd welcome.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. It's nice to see you again. It's nice to have two opportunities today to ask about what's happening in the world. I want to start with Belarus because earlier today, the Free Belarus Caucus had a press conference with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is the pro-democracy leader of the movement there, and I think she is courageous and inspiring, and they need our help. One of the things we talked about is, given the war in Ukraine and what that has meant for the Belarusian people and the lack of a special envoy for Belarus, there's nobody who can help encourage the Europeans and the U.S. to work together or serve as a conduit to the opposition movement. So can you talk about what you're thinking with respect to a special envoy for Belarus, and when might we see that appointment happen?
No, thank you very much, Senator, for raising that. And yes, two things. As you know, day in, day out, we have the Vilnius-based, Lithuania-based Belarus Affairs Unit that's embedded in our embassy, and they're doing the day in, day out contact because so much, as you know, the Democratic opposition is in Lithuania. But to your point, we're very actively looking at moving forward with the special envoy. What I'm considering right now, looking at, is dual-hatting a very senior official in our European Affairs Bureau to also serve as the envoy, to be able to then go in and out, engage at senior levels with the opposition, even as the Belarus Affairs Unit that's based in Lithuania does the kind of day in, day out engagement.
And so do you have a timetable for when you hope to make that happen?
I hate to say very soon, but very soon. I promise you, very soon.
I will hold you to that. So the next time I see you, hopefully, it will be done. I also want to say how pleased I am to see the robust funding for the Western Balkans in the President's budget, particularly increased funding for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also very pleased to see the work that the State Department has done with our European allies to encourage Serbia and Kosovo to come to some agreement. And I wonder if you could talk about what kind of role the Congress might play and whether there are particular incentives that we should be thinking about to ensure that that agreement actually gets implemented.
Thank you. This is, I think, a hopeful thing. That is the progress that's been made between Serbia and Kosovo, particularly an agreement that was reached just this past weekend to implement, with an implementation roadmap, understandings between them on the path to normalization. And I think what's significant about it, besides the fact that both countries have nominally agreed to do it, is that that's also embedded, those commitments are embedded in their respective European Union accession plans. So that gives them some incentive, I hope, to follow through. We have been, as you pointed out, intimately involved in helping get to this result. The European Union has done a very good job. We have been there every single step along the way. I've engaged both Prime Minister Kurti and President Vučić on numerous occasions on this. So I think there's a moment, there's a positive moment. But to your point, I think it would be tremendously helpful if, in your own engagements with, for example, parliamentarians in both countries, the clear support of the Congress of the United States for moving forward and for implementing these agreements, I think, could be critical. And to some extent, for example, both leaders have to navigate differences of opinion in their legislatures about this. I think your voice on this could make a real difference. So I'd strongly encourage that, as well as in your engagements with the leaders themselves.
I certainly think there's a lot of interest on the part of the members of this committee in doing that and thinking about how we can be supportive of the implementation of the agreement actually happening. One of the issues, as you know, is non-recognition by a number of European countries. Is this an issue that you are raising with those 5 countries, and are you seeing any progress?
It's very much an issue that we're raising, we'll continue to raise, but I also think this agreement, again, assuming it moves forward, actually puts us on a path to toward recognition by these countries. Now, Serbia itself, that may be another matter for some time, but if they get to a normalized relationship, that would, I think, have very positive effects just in the day in, day out interactions, and I think we'll eventually get there. But for the 5 holdout countries, the fact that both countries now have reached this agreement, and assuming they implement it, that will, I think, move them to toward recognition.
I agree. I certainly think it helps, and I think it's really important for the people in both Kosovo and Serbia to see some benefit in their personal lives from that kind of an agreement that reduces tensions and hopefully moves both countries towards membership in the EU. On Lebanon, another area where they are facing real challenges, what are we doing to try and encourage the government of Lebanon to implement necessary reforms in order to get the IMF and the World Bank to support the economic efforts that need to happen there, and what more can we do?
This is another very significant challenge. The reality is, without sugarcoating it, is that the economy is in a tailspin. And you've got vacancies in the presidency, in the cabinet. Parliament needs to actually elect a president. That's long in the making. Form a government, and on that basis be able to actually implement the reforms that were necessary to secure an IMF program. So in part, there's a chicken-egg problem here between the necessary movement on the political side and what we believe is vital on the economic side. It really is, as best we can tell, the only way out, the only way to pull back from the precipice. I don't see an international bailout coming. I really think the IMF program is critical, but to get to the IMF program, you've got to have a government in place. At the same time, we have been a very significant donor of assistance. We continue to focus on livelihood support for 2 critical institutions, the Lebanese Armed Forces and the Internal Security Forces. These are the state guarantors of Lebanon's sovereignty, and they've been incredibly challenged. The value of the dollar equivalent in salary to a member of the Lebanese Armed Forces has declined, by 90%. So their purchasing power has basically gone to zero. That's what we've been trying to shore up. It's really important that these institutions stay and stick together. It's critical for the state, and of course, it's critical to push back against Hezbollah, trying to say, no, we're going to do that because these institutions can't. So we're very, very focused there, and we, of course, have also been focused on some energy agreements that we're working to do, and there are a number of challenges that come with those, but I think there is at least some hope on the energy supply side that we're very actively working on. But this is usually challenged.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for being here today, and certainly it's been a long day for you, at least listening to all the questions that you're receiving today. I know that Dr. Barrasso spent some time talking about fentanyl and the crisis that we have as a nation. Last month at a hearing here, I had an opportunity to talk about a friend of mine, a former business school dean at the College of Charleston, whose son, Alan Shao, his namesake, lost his life to fentanyl on the first use. And it is hard to think about this crisis simply by thinking about the numbers. Over 70,000 other American families have had a similar experience. These are fathers, brothers, sisters, daughters, all lost because of fentanyl. And I know that you spoke sometime with Dr. Barrasso about the importance of Mexico and precursors from China and the approach that we should take with the Mexican cartels. I'd like for you to illuminate some of the work that we're doing, because as I look through the budget, I see a lot in the form of technical assistance, but I don't see a lasting commitment to confronting this challenge. And Secretary, I know that you know that just a few weeks ago, a few South Carolinians were kidnapped and some died at the hands of the Mexican cartels. So we take this issue seriously as a nation, but at home,
This is a sensitive and serious issue. I'd like to know what we're doing from a all-of-government approach, not simply your department, but seeing it from a panoramic view, number one. Number two, what else can be done with Mexico? And number three, I know that there are times when fentanyl could literally be shipped from China straight to America. What can we do to cut that off?
Thank you very much, Senator. And I could not agree with you more. I deeply share this concern, and I think you're exactly right that it's so important to put a name and a face to it, because these numbers become abstractions. And, you know, hopefully we'd be galvanized by the fact that it is the #1 killer of Americans aged 18 to 49.
Amazing.
But it does come down to these individual stories. And I also fully agree with you that we have to have, and I believe we do have, a comprehensive approach that here at home, I mentioned, we're of course working, as we always need to, on the demand side, on the treatment side, on the antidote side. That's vitally important, but of course that doesn't answer the problem. It's a necessary component of it. Second, we talked a little bit about this with Senator Barrasso. On the border itself, we do have good technology that can better detect the efforts to smuggle pills that are produced in Mexico and brought over the border, because 95% of this is coming through legal ports of entry. It's not being smuggled across points of the border that are you know, in between points of entry, but at the points of entry. There is the technology that can better detect that. Third, though,
Secretary, on that point,
please.
Is there high utilization of the technology that we have?
So I think it's, as I understand it, and this is not, I don't want to try to speak authoritatively because it's beyond my area of immediate expertise, but as I understand it, you know, we've been working as a government over several years now, over a couple of administrations, to deploy this technology. It's been a little slower than I think everyone would have liked. It's now speeding up. And in fact, there was a very interesting piece, I think, a week or two ago in the Washington Post, laying out some of the work that's being done. But we need to press the accelerator on that because the technology is effective. When I was last in Mexico with President Biden, one of the things that we talked about with President Lopez Obrador was the deployment of this technology as well on the Mexican side of the border. So that's two. Three, to your point, we have to press even harder on the accelerator in the work that we're doing jointly and supporting Mexico in breaking up these cartels, breaking up the finance networks, taking down the labs. Of course, it's not just the precursors of the pills themselves, it's the pill presses that are fabricated and that come across, all that. Now, in fairness, they are making a very significant effort, and they have put far more resources into this. They have actually done an effective job in disbanding, disrupting labs, but arresting dozens of high-ranking officials in these cartels. But you know, these labs, as you know, can fit in a room.
Pop back up.
Yeah, just pop back up. So that's challenge. But there's one last thing. I know.
Two questions with 2 minutes left. So
very quickly.
wrap up.
The other big piece I mentioned is internationally, one of the big problems is the diversion of perfectly legal precursors into illicit use in making fentanyl. We have seized the G20, the largest economies in the world. We just had a foreign ministers meeting. I got put on the agenda as an action item for the G20, building out a coalition to try to deal more effectively with this. And what does that mean? It means simply, among other things, that working with the private sectors in all of these countries, we do a better job sharing information about diversion, getting better labeling on legal precursors that then get diverted, and making sure that there's a program in place so that you know your customer. If you're shipping a chemical, you actually know where it's going. You put all of these pieces together, I think you can have a greater impact.
Thank you. According to the recent report from the IAEA, Iran is getting dangerously close to having weapons-grade plutonium. Last month, the agency reported the discovery of uranium particles enriched up to 84%, 6% below the threshold necessary to create a nuclear weapon. Given the regime's brutal crackdown against peaceful protesters and their own efforts to sabotage the negotiations, to most people in the room, it seems clear that negotiating a new JCPOA should be completely off the table. From my perspective, I hope that's yours as well. What practical steps are you taking to work with our allies and partners to actually address this threat, especially given the fact that certain sanction requirements are about to lapse?
Thank you. Well, as a practical matter, the JCPOA is not on the table at this moment, in large part because as we were working in good faith to see if we could get a mutual return to compliance by Iran and by the United States, the Iranians rejected a proposal that was on the table put forward by the European Union, by our European partners, actually endorsed even by Russia and China. They rejected that last summer, and they have not demonstrated seriousness in that. We are determined one way or another that Iran not acquire a nuclear weapon. I have to tell you, we continue to believe that in terms of getting an effective result, diplomacy is still the most effective way to do that, but it takes two to tango, as we would say, and the Iranians have not demonstrated seriousness of purpose. Meanwhile, we are working in close concert with allies and partners. I was talking about this a little bit earlier. I think we now have a much more shared perspective on this challenge. I think minds have also been galvanized by what's happened in the streets of Iran over the last 6 or 9 months, by the provision by Iran to Russia of drone technology for the war of aggression against Ukraine. And all of that has brought countries closer together in trying to deal with some of these egregious actions.
I know I'm out of time, but short question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll try and be short.
U.S. embassies in Africa.
Yeah.
There's a shortage of staff. What are you doing about it? And frankly, you think about the CCP and its issues and its growth through its Belt and Road projects. Seems like we need to have more focus on Africa than we have. I know that you've had some work with the African Leaders Summit. Love to hear your thoughts on A, the shortage, and B, strategy.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is something we're very actively working on. This shortage is a problem. Actually, in the budget, we have increased dollars for additional hires. That will help in part. It won't solve the problem, but it will help address the problem. We're also reviewing why some of our posts don't receive sufficient bids, because, as you know, the way this works in part is our Foreign Service officers say, hey, here's where I want to go. And we've seen in a number of countries, the bids just aren't there. We're trying to understand why that is, and then to see what we can do to incentivize people to serve in posts that, for one reason or another, have not been attracting the personnel they deserve.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's always a pleasure to have you before the committee. Thank you very much for your service. Let me start with an issue that Senator Menendez raised in his opening comments, and that is the capacity of the State Department to meet the challenges that we have globally. I think never in our history have we had so many global challenges in which the work of the State Department can be critically important for us achieving our objectives. Senator Hagerty and I have worked together in regards to the State Department's capacity to deal with these issues. We made several recommendations in the last Congress that were enacted into law. I know that you've been questioned on this before the Appropriations Committee, but I want to get our committee engaged on these issues as well. In that recommendations, some were more short-term changes that we thought should be made as quickly as possible, including dealing with the training capacity at the State Department by having a board of visitors, by making it a more professional educational experience, by expanding training opportunities. We thought these are proposals that could be implemented in the short term. Others were longer term issues, and that's why we recommended a commission, which is now in the process of being named. And I would like to get your understanding about how to implement these changes. They were done, I think, with full support and cooperation from the leadership at the State Department. We know you always have challenges. Part of this is going to be budgetary. For people to go into training, you have to be able to backfill those positions. That's not always available. So tell me how you think you can use the tools that we made available in the last Congress to implement these changes, and what we can do to help you moving forward.
Well, first, let me just say how much I appreciate the work that you've done on this and the leadership on it. It is hugely important to the future of the department. It's hugely important to our ability to attract but also retain the best talent. And we're in a competition for talent, and we need to make sure that we have the tools not just to recruit people, but to make sure that they stay at the department. I think a big part of that is career-long learning, because as we've been talking about in many ways, things are changing so fast that unless you're able to, as an institution, make sure that your people have the ability to continuously upgrade their game, you're not going to be able to do the job. Now, I think some of the tools, authorities, resources provided by Congress to us are making a big difference. For example, over the last couple of years, and now in our budget, I hope that will be realized this year, we've been able to hire a significantly greater number of people, both foreign service officers as well as civil servants. That has tremendous benefits, one of which, of course, is making sure that when we have gaps in places, we have the personnel to fill them. But one of the most critical, I think, initiatives we're taking is making sure that we have a significant float of personnel by which we can pull out of day in, day out service someone, put them into a training program of some kind, whether it's one that we're doing ourselves, time at an academic institution, time, by the way, here at in Congress, and do it in a way that doesn't disrupt the day in, day out activities of the department. That's a big initiative. We now have real resources to do that in ways we never had before. Second, you talked about the short term. I couldn't agree more. We just spent a morning with the Foreign Service Institute leadership on new programs they're putting in place for both incoming but also mid-career learning, particularly in areas that the department has not, in the past usually been focused on, and where we need to have critical skills and have people develop them. So you will see, and we'll share with you, I think, some very significant initiatives that are creating important opportunities for career-long learning developed by the Foreign Service Institute that we'll be actually implementing very, very soon. So there are a host of things that I think will make a real difference. I think the moving out on the Board of Visitors, on the provost, we're doing that. We're preparing actually the position description for the provost as we speak so that we can begin the hiring process. We're actually leveraging the results of some, I think, important assessments in terms of what we're looking for and what we need. And we're on track to have the Board of Visitors identified and recruited by the end of this year.
And in regards to the commission,
Yeah.
some were appointed by the Congress, but some were appointed by the administration. Is that advancing on the administration side?
Yes, and I think not only is it advancing, I believe that we've asked actually your respective teams for recommendations, and we really look to that. And I also believe that we actually have the resources even within our existing authorities to move forward on that.
Part of this in training deals with an area that I've talked about frequently with you, and that is our anti-corruption efforts.
Yeah.
President's talked about that as a national security core concern. We find that one of the resistance we get to being more active in establishing international standards on corruption is the capacity of our missions, particularly in country, to be able to evaluate and move forward on anti-corruption programs. Are you taking steps to improve the capacity at the State Department to deal with this priority area?
Yeah, we've really elevated this. As you know, we have we put in place a senior official who is charged with this responsibility. And one of the things that I've been working on, and I think it's important across the institution, is, we do a lot as an institution that is it's top down. We do some that's bottom up. Probably need to do more. Where we really need to be doing more is horizontally across the institution, by which I mean this. On anti-corruption, this needs to be embedded horizontally in all of our different bureaus, in our regional bureaus, but also as well in some of our functional bureaus. So what I've been pushing is for the senior official and his team responsible for dealing with anti-corruption to be engaged on the takeoff, not just on the landing, with different colleagues across the enterprise so that they have the focus, and they also dedicate the time and resources within their areas of responsibility to making combating corruption one of their responsibilities. So I think we're making progress there. I'm sure we can do more, but I'm very seized with this mission because something that you've been leading on for many, many years. There are few things that are more corrosive of democratic systems than corruption.
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. Senator Hegarty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take a minute from my National Security Advisor, Bobby Zarate, to put up a photo that concerns me very much, and I'm certain it does you as well, Mr. Secretary, probably all of us here. It's a photo of CCP diplomat Wang Yi with Iranian and Saudi officials. It's not a good thing. It's the anti-Abraham Accords, in my view. What it's doing is it depicts the normalization of relations with Iran rather than our ally Israel. It's certainly not a situation that I think that Saudi Arabia and Iran would have come to of their own accord. So my question of you, Mr. Secretary, is what exactly did Communist China promise to Saudi Arabia and to Iran to get them to come to this agreement?
So, Senator, I think there's a backstory here, and I think it's in some sense a little bit more complicated. The Saudis and the Iranians have been talking for the better part of the last couple of years, including in Oman, including in Baghdad, to look to see if they could get back to where they were before they interrupted their diplomatic relations. You remember the Saudis put to death a prominent Shia cleric. That resulted in a protest or storming of the Saudi embassy in Tehran. They broke off diplomatic relations, I think, back in 2016. But in the last couple of years, not a couple of months, they've been looking to see if they could get back to a slightly more normal place. And based on the information we have, I think what China did, you know, in a sense cleverly, was to, at the very end of that process, take advantage of the work that these countries had done and then basically host the conclusion of the agreement that they reached to restore diplomatic relations, not to bring it together themselves. They just happened to be the host of it. And I think it, you know, sent a diplomatic signal. There's no doubt about that. I have to say, I see some positives to this as well as some concerns. The positives are these. If, and there's a big if here, because we really don't know if the commitments made under this agreement will actually be implemented. That really remains to be seen. And we've seen in the past that Iran has promised to do things that, of course, it's not done. But if they do, and principally, if they cease or reduce their support to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who, among other things, are attacking Saudi Arabia and helping to perpetuate a war in Yemen, if that stops or decreases, that can be beneficial. It can be beneficial to ending the war in Yemen. It can be beneficial to helping defend or make sure that Saudi Arabia is not under attack. There are 80,000 Americans in Saudi Arabia. We have an interest in that too. So it's a long way of saying, if this results in the curbing of some of Iran's malicious activities, I actually don't think that's a bad thing. By the way, it does not in any way substitute for our determination to pursue the deepening as well as the expansion of the Abraham Accords. I had a long discussion with Prime Minister Netanyahu about this when I was recently in Israel. We're very focused on that, and I also don't think it will change the interests of other countries in pursuing that.
To go back to the photo itself, though, I think the image itself suggests to me that China may be trying to pull our ally Saudi Arabia into their orbit, along with Russia and Iran. It also suggests to me that China may be laying the groundwork for, you know, a petro-yuan environment rather than to replace the petrodollar. I think this is something that would benefit from a deeper conversation with you, perhaps a conversation in closed session, and I might ask the chairman and ranking member if we could arrange that at some point soon. I think that would be beneficial. I'd like to show another image that is also quite concerning. This is an image of CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin, who recently held high-profile meetings in Moscow. This is also not a good thing. In a video released overnight, Chairman Xi tells Putin that Communist China and Russia are going to be pushing for changes not seen for 100 years. And I'd like to know, Mr. Secretary, what changes not seen for 100 years is Xi Jinping talking about? And would that be detrimental to U.S. national security interests? What impact would those changes have on U.S. national security interests?
Well, I think it's no secret that both countries have a very different worldview than our own, or for that matter, a different worldview than dozens and dozens of our allies and partners around the world. And in particular, they have a different view of what a world order and rules of the road should look like than we do. And I think when it comes to China, they actually want a world order, but an illiberal one. We continue to stand strongly for a liberal one. I'm not sure that Russia or Vladimir Putin wants a world order, maybe more like world disorder, but in part as a result of having this very different worldview than we do. They have a marriage of convenience. I'm not sure if it's conviction. Russia is very much the junior partner in this relationship. And we've seen that, again, on display quite literally right here before us. Recall, as you know, right before the Russian aggression against Ukraine, they had a meeting. They talked about a partnership with no limits, and we've seen further expression of that. But as they've been doing this, we have been, over the last 2 years, re-energizing, rejuvenating, re-engaging all of our alliances and partnerships, and in ways that are paying tremendous dividends, both in dealing with the Russian aggression against Ukraine and in dealing with some of the challenges posed by China. We have greater convergence today with allies and partners in Europe as well as in Asia on how to deal with those challenges than we've had, certainly in my memory. And besides doing that, we've also created new collections, new coalitions of countries that are kind of more fit for purpose on individual issues. I mentioned earlier the Mineral Security Partnership, where we're getting countries together.
Yeah, I'm going to have to, just because of time, I have to go to my next question, but this is a topic we've discussed in the past. I know you've discussed with my colleagues today, and that has to do with fentanyl and the ravages that it's creating on America. We spoke about this a year ago, and since we spoke about it, how many sanctions have been placed on Chinese individuals or entities that are involved in the fentanyl trade?
What we've been working to do, the aspect of China that is deeply problematic, as you know, when it comes to fentanyl, is the production in China of precursors that then become used in the production of fentanyl. And we have had sought to try to get China to, in a cooperative way, because it's actually in their interest to do this, to deal more effectively in cracking down on the diversion of those precursors.
I'm going to interrupt just in the interest of time. I understand that you've sought to do so, but it's not worked. And in fact, there have been 0 sanctions issued since you and I talked about this. How hard would it be for President Biden to pick the phone up and call President Xi Jinping tomorrow and lay out a set of consequences, including sanctions, that are going to be delivered upon China if they don't stop sending fentanyl and fentanyl precursors here to kill our youth? 70,000 young people a year are dying at this, 23 times the deaths associated with the 9/11 attacks. This is a war on our youth. We've got to do something about it, Mr. Secretary.
And like you, I am very seized with this, including in my own engagements with Chinese counterparts and Chinese officials. We've made very clear to them that we need to see this cooperation on dealing with synthetic opioids and fentanyl. And if that cooperation is not forthcoming, we're going to have to look at other steps that we can take. What we want to do is to make sure that we are being as effective as possible. One of the challenges when it comes to, as I mentioned, China is that what often happens is perfectly, as you know, legal chemicals, precursors, get diverted either intentionally or unintentionally, in some cases, to the illicit production of fentanyl. There are agreements, systems, procedures that we want to put in place, which is why I seized the G20 with this just a few weeks ago, and now have agreement from the G20, which includes China, leading countries, economies in the world, to work on this together. For example, much better information sharing, labeling, know your customer, so that at least when it comes to the unintentional diversion of these precursors, we're doing something about that. Now, if it's intentional, that, of course, is a different matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you this afternoon. Thank you for your testimony this morning in appropriations. And for the benefit of Chairman Menendez, I thank the Secretary for the implementation of the Foreign Service Families Act that we passed a couple years ago. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your help in getting that through the United States Congress. We also discussed the meeting that took place that was just portrayed in this photograph between Putin and Xi. And Mr. Secretary, you underscored what I think is an imperative, that we be prepared, fully prepared, if China provides material military support to Russia, to work in concert with our allies to immediately impose very tough economic sanctions. And I know work's being done to make sure we're ready to do that. I understand the issue of the Critical Minerals Security Partnership was raised here, so I won't go over that. I do want to follow through on a couple issues that were raised at this morning's hearing. One by my colleague, Senator Schatz, on the issue of press freedom. Because I appreciate very much the State Department Human Rights Report, and I appreciate the fact that it is insulated, I think, to the extent possible and pretty well from political forces. I know what a challenge that is. I do want to just raise concerns about crackdown on freedom of the press in 2 countries where I hope we will continue to have strong relations with. One is a country I've spent a lot of time in, a member of the Quad, and that's India. If you look at recent reports, there's a significant crackdown on press freedom in India. It is the world's largest democracy, but this is very, very troubling. The other is neighboring Pakistan. which at times has had a very vibrant press, but right now we're seeing a critical crackdown. And I just want to point out that the State Department Human Rights Report, which was just released Monday, indicates that both India and Pakistan have seen increasing threats on press freedom. Both countries are increasingly dangerous places for journalists trying to do their jobs. And the State Department's not alone in this. Other organizations that are out there to protect freedom of the press have indicated both these countries have serious problems. Reporters Without Borders ranks India 150 out of 180, and Pakistan 157 out of 180. So I'm not going to go into great detail today, but I am interested in following up with you and your team on those issues. I do want to pick up on our earlier conversation today about some concerning actions taken by the government of Israel as we work to try to create a period of time where we can de-escalate. And this morning, you agreed that the recent action taken by the Knesset, really just yesterday, that rolled back the agreement made more than 20 years ago by Israel to evacuate 4 settlements was inconsistent with the obligations that the government of Israel has taken on in Aqaba and Sharm el-Sheikh. And I think we need to press those issues on both sides whenever we see violations of this agreement. I do want to talk about certain elements of the new government, which are really extreme forces within this government. One of them is Ben-Gvir. The other is Smotrich. Ben-Gvir is and these are not backbenchers. They're not backbenchers. They have very important responsibilities within this new government. Ben-Gvir is the Minister of National Security in charge of statewide law enforcement and the Israeli police. Smotrich is the Minister of Finance and also, as you know, minister in the Defense Ministry that has authority over civilian issues in the West Bank, including illegal construction and authority over planning and construction for settlements. Just a few days ago, Smotrich commented as follows, that there is no such thing as Palestinians because there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. This was condemned by Biden administration officials, and Mr. Secretary, you're here today. Do you join in condemning that comment?
I do.
And this is not the first time, right, that Smotrich has made these very incendiary comments, incitements to violence. It was just a few weeks ago where he stated in reference to the Palestinian village of Hawara that it needs to be, quote, wiped out, unquote, and that, quote, the state of Israel should do it, unquote. Now, I agree with President Biden as a longtime supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship that it's been built on interests and built on values. You have to agree, Mr. Secretary, that those comments by Smotrich, Minister of Finance, and somebody who has an important portfolio over the West Bank, those do not reflect our values, do they?
They do not, and I would also point out that the second comment you alluded to on Hawara, Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted that the person in question walk those comments back, which he did,
right,
for what that's worth. I'd also note that the legislation you referred to, which again we think is indeed inconsistent with commitments made, and in fact inconsistent with long-standing commitments, because those were commitments undertaken, I believe, during the Bush administration.
Yeah.
My understanding is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that they have no intention of actually, the government, this was a Knesset law, has no intention of actually moving forward on the authorities that it's been apparently given.
So, Mr. Secretary, all of this raises the issue that Prime Minister Netanyahu says he has 2 hands on the steering wheel, meaning that he's in control of this government. But we're looking at actions his ministers are taking and actions in portfolios that are very significant that go directly contrary to that. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, as we discussed this morning, specifically himself disavowed the agreement reached in Aqaba within 24 hours of it having been reached. So I just go back to make my final point I did this morning, which is I appreciate the statements that have been made by Biden administration officials. I think, Mr. Secretary, it's important for you personally also to continue to speak out. And I think we look weak when we see time after time actions taken inconsistent with our positions with no consequence at all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Senator, good to see you.
You have spoken passionately, and I believe honestly, about your commitment to helping Ukraine defeat Vladimir Putin. I agree wholeheartedly that it is an important national security interest of the United States for Russia to lose. Putin is a KGB thug who seeks to reassemble the Soviet empire at the expense of American interest and at the expense of the safety and security of Americans. And of course, in China, Xi is watching closely to see how America responds to Putin's aggression. I'm deeply concerned, however, that no matter how much you may want to help Ukraine, there is something the Biden administration wants more, which is to re-enter a nuclear agreement with Iran. This administration has shown weakness on Iran since day one and continues to do so. Just in the last few weeks, there have been reports that you again waived congressional sanctions to allow Iraq to move money to the Central Bank of Iran, which the Ayatollah uses for terrorism, for ballistic missile development, and nuclear weapons work. Of course, that's not all Iran is doing. In January, Mr. Secretary, you publicly assessed that Iran had become, quote, Russia's top military backer. That's a quote. And indeed, Russia uses Iranian banks and tankers and planes to move weapons and to dodge sanctions. Yet the administration and the State Department in particular continue to allow Russia-Iranian cooperation out of a refusal to crack down on Iran. The Biden administration is boosting and in many cases funding both sides of this war. If you look at energy, and I want to start with this, I want to ask you about the use by Russia of Iranian oil tankers. As you know, Iran violates U.S. energy sanctions by using its own tankers, as well as a ghost fleet of foreign flag ships. You've allowed that ghost fleet to grow dramatically. The Iranians were using about 70 tankers when President Biden was elected. Today, they're using about 300 tankers. You did not sanction those tankers. Instead, the administration allowed Iran to restore its energy exports, getting above 1 million barrels a day, which is funding the regime and funding the war on Ukraine. Last month was the highest oil exports Iran has had since 2018. Now, we can argue about what that means for Iran, but I want to ask what it means for Ukraine and for Russia. Russia is now using dozens and dozens of tankers from that ghost fleet that the administration allowed to grow in violation of our energy sanctions directly to aid Putin's aggression in Ukraine. Why hasn't the Biden administration sanctioned them?
Senator, two things. First, going back to the first point, the symbiotic relationship that we're seeing emerge between Iran and Russia, to include the provision by Iran of drone technology to Russia for use in Ukraine, and the provision by Russia to Iran, or the threatened provision of weapon systems, including planes. This is something that we are very actively and aggressively working to break up across the government. We have gone after the drone network, working to sanction dozens of individuals.
Have you reimposed the oil sanctions?
And we are looking at the most effective way we can.
Have you reimposed the oil sanctions?
At the Ghost Fleet. So we have imposed sanctions across the entire UAV network. We're looking at how we can most effectively deal with the Ghost Fleet.
Have you stopped the Ayatollah from selling 1 million barrels a day of oil?
We're working on making sure that we can do that effectively.
It was done in the prior administration. It was this administration that refused to enforce those sanctions that allowed billions of dollars to flow to the Ayatollah that's being used to attack the Ukrainians right now.
We're working every day to enforce the existing sanctions on Iran, even as we're looking at imposing new ones.
Mr. Secretary, with respect, that's not remotely true. The oil sanctions you could enforce tomorrow, but it is a political decision not to enforce it, and you are providing the funds that Iran is using to provide drones that are attacking Ukrainian military and attacking Ukrainian civilians. You said you just noticed recently the growing cooperation between Russia and Iran. If you were not aware of that 2 years ago, this administration has not been paying attention. Let's talk, for example, about Russian-Iranian nuclear cooperation. President Zelensky has repeatedly said that Russia is compensating Iran for weapons through nuclear cooperation. Last year, you signed waivers specifically related to the Iran nuclear deal that suspended congressional sanctions against Russia and Iran, conducting exactly this kind of nuclear cooperation. You recently renewed these waivers. President Zelensky is right. You know that, so much so that in your recent transmissions you wrote to Congress that previous waivers you had issued, quote, would expand Iran's nuclear programs and further deepen cooperation between Iran and Russia at a time that Iran is providing lethal aid to Russia for its use in its illegal invasion in Ukraine. But you didn't cancel the waivers. Instead, you signed them, enabling broad Russia-Iranian nuclear cooperation. Why did you sign these waivers, and why did you do so repeatedly?
These waivers have been in the non-proliferation interests of the United States, particularly to make sure that materials that Iran could use to develop its nuclear program were shipped out of Iran, and to make sure that facilities in Iran would not be developed in a way that could lead to further proliferation or the advancement of the program. In the last instance, we have narrowed the waivers significantly, again, to make sure that they're focused only on activities that actually advance our non-proliferation goals. To make sure that
Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, that answer does not pass the laugh test. Under this administration, you have allowed Iran to get to the brink of a nuclear weapon. There's no work being conducted to make the program safer. Russia is on the side of Iran, and Iran is on the side of Russia. They're both against us. And it's staggering that the Biden administration would say Russia's still on our side trying to constrain Iran. You could halt this cooperation. You could halt the civilian nuclear cooperation with Russia. You could halt the oil sales. But this administration is not willing to do so because of politics. And as a result, the billions of dollars the Ayatollah is getting because of your decisions and President Biden's decisions are funding the war in Ukraine. Why is this administration funding both sides of this war?
I fundamentally disagree with that judgment, Senator. We had Iran's nuclear program in a box. Unfortunately, it got out of that box as a result of pulling out, not by us, of the nuclear agreement. As a result, despite the maximum pressure that's been exerted by the previous administration.
Would you answer the question I asked? Why are you funding both sides of the war?
That nuclear program has moved forward.
Would you answer the question, why are you funding both sides of the Ukraine war?
We're not funding both sides. We're trying to make sure, wherever we can, that we're pushing back on Iran having access to resources.
But you're not going to stop the oil sales.
We're looking at the most effective way to deal with.
Enforce the sanctions. It's not complicated.
Senator Booker.
Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you. And I want to thank you again for having members of this committee over to the State Department. I thought it was a really productive conversation. I just want to jump in first and foremost just about food security in general. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was extended on March 18th. It gives me a lot of hope, but for only 60 days, unfortunately. And half of that time period stipulated really in the original agreement makes me have some concerns. Relief agencies themselves, as you know, have been expressing disappointment in the shortened duration, stressing that a lot of the countries in East Africa will be entering the lean season and have a lot of crises. I know negotiations to allow for the safe passage of commercial ships carrying Ukrainian agricultural exports from the Black Sea have really been facing challenges. We know that the Russians are doing a lot of things to slow down the processes. They've created backlogs, and there's been a significant drop. I know you're aware of all this. Can you just help me better understand the importance of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, how the administration is working to ensure Russia fully meets its obligations, and have you started to work with other countries dependent upon Russia and Ukraine grain to become more food sovereign and independent?
Yeah. So a couple of things. Thank you, Senator, for raising that. It's hard to overstate the importance of the Black Sea Grain Corridor. As you know well, Ukraine had been, before the Russian aggression, one of the main breadbaskets of the world, including Africa. And one of the results of the Russian aggression, of course, was to disrupt significantly its export of grain, of wheat. The Black Sea Grain Corridor has been it never should have been necessary in the first place, because it was only necessary because Russia was blocking exports out of Ukraine, blocking the port of Odessa. But once put in place, was a significant success, getting out about 24 million metric tons of grain from Ukraine, the equivalent of 8 billion loaves of bread. The vast majority of that was going to the global south. It's had a direct impact. By the way, when I was just in Ethiopia, I saw large sacks of Ukrainian grain that were there as a result of the Black Sea Grain Corridor Initiative. So it's imperative that it be sustained. There is a renewal, but the Russians continue to manipulate it and play with it. The number of ships, as you mentioned, that are actually allowed to go through, they have been playing games with, so that the number of ships is smaller. We're pushing every day on the UN and with the UN and others to make sure that not only is it sustained, but it's allowed to operate efficiently and effectively. However, even with that, we have been seized with the global food crisis and global food insecurity in two ways, and very quickly. One is, of course, dealing with the emergency problem that so many countries are facing. Over the last year, we provided, on top of what we were already doing, an additional $13.5 billion to advance food security around the world and to deal with emergency situations. We're by far the largest donor to the World Food Program. We provide about 50% of its budget.
And do you think that the fiscal year 2024 request of, I think it's about $5 billion, if I'm getting this right, is that enough?
I want to say at this point, I believe it is, but this is a perfect storm in so many ways that could get worse. So we want to make sure that we retain the flexibility. We have the Feed the Future program, which is dealing with the longer term aspect of this, which is well funded and is in the budget. This is helping countries actually build their own sustainable productive capacity, not just have to rely on emergency assistance.
Can I dig deeper in your recent trip to Ethiopia? Yeah. You said that both sides have been guilty, really, of war crimes. We see a nation that is going to have a lot of challenges ahead of it. Millions of people are in need of assistance right now, and the security situation remains volatile, and it will probably be contributed to that insecurity will be the sheer needs of the populations. I know the administration is working with UN and other partners to meet this unbelievable humanitarian crisis, but I guess I want to ask you is, are we putting enough resources? I guess the FY24 budget requests $286 million for Ethiopia and $331 million for new humanitarian assistance. I'm just curious, as you engage with people on the ground, are we doing enough in terms of helping that country get up off its knees after this horrific crisis and humanitarian crisis?
So, one, I believe that we are, but I also believe and hope that we'll actually be able to do more. And partly that is dependent on Ethiopia following through on the hugely important agreement that was reached for the cessation of hostilities in Tigray. We're not erasing the last couple of years, and in fact, as you noted, we just announced the other day that it's our assessment that all sides have committed atrocities, and we detailed those. But the agreement that was reached has resulted in this. The guns are silent, humanitarian assistance is flowing to the north, services are being restored, the Eritreans have pulled back and are pulling out, the TPLF has put down its heavy weapons, they're standing up an interim administration, and there is the beginnings of a transitional justice process in place that Prime Minister Abiy is supporting and advancing. What I told him when I saw him was, as they move down this road and implement the very important decisions they've made, that will allow us, and presumably allow Congress, to support greater renewed engagement with Ethiopia, greater renewed support, both in terms of our own assistance programs, some of which, now I will say, despite the last 2 years, when it comes to basic humanitarian assistance in Ethiopia, we've sustained virtually all of it. But there are other things that can be done on an economic level that would really benefit Ethiopia. And as it travels this path of peace, of accountability, of reconciliation, we'll be able to do that. The international financial institutions as well are looking at how they can re-engage.
Can I just really quickly, I know it's a priority for you about diversity and inclusion, and I really appreciate the conversations we've had since before you were even confirmed. In July, a GAO report analyzing the department's DEIA practices provided a lot of recommendations, in short. Can you speak to how the department plans to continue to use the funding requested for the DEIA office, and how the department's implementation to these kind of priorities is going to go forward? And again, has the work that you've been doing in your retention unit informed your department's budget request for priorities? Can you just give me some more?
Yes, in fact, so and thank you for raising the retention unit. First, let me just say very quickly, this has been from day one, and it goes back, Mr. Chairman, to when this committee was good enough to confirm me. I made a commitment that I would see a marker of my success or not in this job, whether or not the institution made real progress in building an institution that actually reflects the country that we're there to represent. So this has been a priority of mine from day one. We established the Office of the CDIO, the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Never had that before, reports directly to me. We have a 5-year strategic plan that was put in place. We have, for the first time, disaggregated data that looks across every office of the department, so we have a clear picture of where we are and where we're not. We have senior officers from every bureau at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level who are assigned to carry this portfolio in their bureaus, from the very beginning of the pipeline to the end of the pipeline. That is, from recruitment all the way to promotion and advancement, with a retention in the middle. We are intensely focused. We're trying to open more hearts and minds to the idea of serving in government and serving hopefully at the State Department. I've done that directly myself, senior officials have. Retention, though, is a critical piece, because what we found is we get people through the door at C Street, but then they don't stay, and disproportionately, the people who don't stay tend to be from groups that have been historically underrepresented at the department. So we need to understand why. And part of that was setting up a retention unit where we have been engaged in interviewing everyone who is willing, who was leaving the department or thinking about leaving the department, as well as doing statistical surveys. But the in-person interviews are really important to try to better understand this. And I've just got the initial results from the first surveys and interviews that are very instructive and illuminating about what it is we can do better to make sure we're retaining people. And then it's vital that people be promoted, that everyone in the department sees that they can aspire to hold the highest jobs in the department. And opening that process up with more transparency, especially at the senior levels, that's something we've done too. Let me just say very quickly, one of the things I'm grateful to the Congress for is, for the first time, we have paid internships, as you know, at the State Department. That means that socioeconomically, we widen the aperture dramatically. The enthusiasm for those has been through the roof. And based on the budget, my hope and expectation is we will get over the next couple of years to having 1,000 paid internships at the department, and that's making a huge difference. We put in place new fellowships that are designed to attract, again, underrepresented populations in the department. We just named one after Colin Powell that we put together last year. We have another one that I think will further diversify the core of our diplomatic security service, which is vitally important. Anyway, it's a long way of saying there is a lot that is going on, and it's something that I'm absolutely seized with. But I want to make sure that, the last thing I'll say is, the more we're able to institutionalize these initiatives so that they remain there long after, you know, I'm gone and others are gone, that's hugely important too. So we're looking at ways to do that effectively.
It's tremendous work, and when it comes to naming fellowships, after this hearing, you might want to name one after Ted Cruz. I'm sure that would go a long way in bipartisan unity and support for the State Department's programs.
Thank you, Senator.
That's good, wise advice from a Jersey boy.
I'm not going to follow on that. But Mr. Secretary, you've been very gracious with your time. I just want to close out on a couple of questions, Please. And then we'll let you go. What do you call a country that violates another country's airspace and territorial waters without provocations, drills in its in another country's exclusive economic zone, that buys Russian military equipment in violation of U.S. law, that has more lawyers and journalists in jail than almost any other country, and jails its main political opponent right before elections, a country that seeks by force to block the rights of a EU country to explore its energy deposits off its outer continental shelf, a country that not has joined EU-led sanctions against Russia, but has exported about $800 million worth of goods to Russia, a country that continues airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, including against U.S. partners like the Syrian Democratic Forces, that stops a critical enlargement of NATO, that continues to occupy a EU country with 40,000 troops, and in violation of UN Security Council resolutions seeks to open up an area that has been frozen by the United Nations, that denies religious freedom to the religious leader of millions of citizens of Greek Orthodox faith, that converts a church into a mosque in violation of its UNESCO commitments, and that arrests and jails U.S. Embassy locally employed staff. What do you call such a country?
I think I would call that a challenging ally.
Well, I call the country Turkey, and the reality is I don't believe that's such a country, and I didn't continue, which I could have, deserves to have F-16 sold to it. I mean, I don't know what messages we send in the world that you can do all of those things, and yet you can get U.S. military assistance at the end of the day. So I know the aspiration we have for Turkey, but it is not the Turkey under President Erdogan. And so it seems to me there has to be a roadmap in which it says if you really want this, then you have to, deal with some of these issues. Because if we just give them the F-16s and all of this remains outstanding, well, I don't know what global message we send. In a similar light, in the past year, we've seen Azerbaijan invade Armenia, manufacture a food security crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh with its ongoing blockade, continue rampant repression domestically, including with the unjustified detention of activists like Bakhtiar Hajiyev. In the past 5 years, we've seen Azerbaijan start a war that killed 6,500 people, forced almost 100,000 Karabakh Armenians from their homes. So I am concerned about providing assistance to the Aliyev regime, but it strikes me as particularly egregious that the administration would request $700,000 in international military education and training funds for Azerbaijan. So can you explain to the American people why we would want to provide military education and training to an aggressor state that attacks its neighbors and violates the rights of its citizens?
So, Senator, I know we've had opportunity to discuss this before. There are a few things here. First of all, when it comes to the military assistance, and particularly to the infamous Section 901 waiver that we engage in, look, there's some very practical reasons for that. One is to actually strengthen, as you know, the interoperability between their forces, ours, NATO's. They engage in peacekeeping. They have a long border with Iran that needs defending. But also, to this point, we think there's real benefit to increasing the Western education, maybe orientation of some of their officers. So that's important. But let me just step back for
well,
1
I hope
second.
that Western education isn't what they've learned to do, what they did in blockading these people, starting a conflict, 6,500 dead. That I hope is not Western education.
Just to step back for 1 second, because I do think this is an important moment and something that I think we should really also pursue the conversation on. I've been very engaged on seeing what we can do to help Armenia and Azerbaijan come to a peace agreement that normalizes the relationship between them, as well as deal with, obviously, the rights and protections for Armenian ethnics in Nagorno-Karabakh, dealing with border delimitation, et cetera. And I think there's an opportunity, I don't want to exaggerate it, but an opportunity actually to bring a peace agreement to fruition. I had Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Aliyev together in Munich at the security conference. I've had the foreign ministers here in Washington. I expect that they'll come back. We've worked on a text, and this is not something that we're imposing on Armenia. We're answering the strong desire expressed by Armenia to see if we can help them reach an agreement, which would end at least, in many ways, 30-plus years of conflict. It's challenging and it's fraught. At the same time, you're exactly right to point out the real problems in the Latin corridor with the ability of people, private citizens, commercial traffic to flow to get what's needed to people in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm pressing on Azerbaijan, including as recently as this week, to reopen that corridor. So we're working on that. But I do think that there is, without exaggerating it, a moment of opportunity here that would profoundly be in the interests of the people of Armenia, as well as Azerbaijan.
Well, as we are aspiring to that, and that's a worthy aspiration, but I hope that we are committed to making sure that humanitarian assistance reaches the Karabakh Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I hope you use your good offices to make that happen. Two last things. Your announcement of your determination related to war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ethiopia was well welcomed, and I salute you for it. I, along with other senators, have been pushing for such a determination for 2 years. I agree with your position that justice and accountability for the crimes committed during the course of the war are a fundamental element of a sustainable peace. State Department officials have indicated that human rights monitors will have full and unfettered access to Tigray in the wake of the November agreements. Will you commit to update your determination periodically as the monitors gather more information?
Yes, we're tracking this, Mr. Chairman, every step along the way, and the access for monitors is a vital part of this agreement.
Okay, that's great. And will any update include a finding related to the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia's report from September of last year that, quote, the denial and obstruction of humanitarian access to Tigray region by the federal government and allied regional state governments was committed for the purpose of depriving the Tigrayan population of objects indispensable for its survival, including food?
Well, I actually think that's reflected in our determination. If you look at the determination that we made, there are a number of different elements that apply. Some do not apply to all of the actors in this. And one of the things that is clear in the determination that we made was that, in effect, trying to cut off the population of Tigray from humanitarian access constituted a serious offense that we noted in our determination.
All right. Well, we look forward to that. I hope we will commit to supporting the extension of the mandate of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia as part of our effort. Lastly, I want to echo Senator Booker's. As you know, I've had a nearly 30-year journey on diversity with the State Department. It's been most of the time rather lonely, most of the time unsuccessful. And so I appreciate the answer that you gave him. And I just hope that as we pursue that diversity is as broad as possible. And that what we're doing in the budget, which seeks the recruitment and retention of an additional 164 foreign service and 351 civil service personnel, is going to have these DEIA initiatives, penetrating that effort as well. Is that what your expectation?
Yes, and in fact, we made changes to the Foreign Service exam to make sure that it was unintentionally, but as a practical matter, actually being more of a barrier to diversification than it should be. We've also, among other things, made working for advancing the DEIA one of the criteria for promotion in the department.
Okay. Well, I look forward to holding a hearing later this year with the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer of the department, which was in and of itself a good step. But of course, all of that only matters if we see change in numbers, which I appreciate from your answer to Senator Booker. You're working on trying to make a reality. So Senator Risch had to leave, but he asked me on behalf of both of us to thank you. You've been very gracious with your time, very thorough in your answers. This hearing record will remain open to the close of business on Wednesday, March the 29th. If there are questions for the record, please submit it no later than then. With the thanks of the committee, this hearing is adjourned.